get this microphone down here, and I know it's not where it need to be. I don't know what the power problem is with it. It's not loud enough. But I just try to do my best. Hold on. Then I'm gonna bring down this.
Rapidity, 233. This round robin of course produced a profound sensation in the United States. It was just what the American public had long suspected was the case. Shortly afterwards, Secretary of War Alger resigned, coming, as it did on the heels of the scandal about M-bomb beef having been furnished to the army in Cuba. It made him too much of a load for the administration to carry. He was succeeded by M.R. Root, an eminent member of the New York Bar, whose masterful mind soon saw the essentials of the situation and proceeded to get a volunteer army recruited, equipped, and sent to the Philippines without further unnecessary delay. Chapter XII. Otis and the WAR continued. And now, a man of head being at the center of it, the whole matter gets vital. Carlyle's French Revolution. There can surely be little doubt in any quarter that M.R. Root is, in intellectual endowment and equipment at least, one of the greatest, if he is not the greatest, of living American statesmen. Mankind will always yield due acclaim to men who, in great emergencies, see the essentials of a given situation, and at once proceed to get the thing done that ought to be done. Whether the war in the Philippines was regrettable or not, it had become, by midsummer of 1899, supremely important, from any rational and patriotic standpoint, to end it as soon as possible. M.R. Root had not been in office as Secretary of War very long before fleets of troop ships, carrying some 25 well-equipped volunteer regiments, 234, were swarming out of New York Harbor, bound from Manila by way of the Suez Canal, and out of the Golden Gate for the same destination via Honolulu. Nor was there any confusion as in the Cuban helter-skelter. Everything went as if by clockwork. Moreover, along with the new and ample force, went a clear, masterly, comprehensive plan of campaign, prepared, not by General Otis at Manila, but in the War Department at Washington, by officers already familiar with the islands. It was the purpose of this government at last to demonstrate conclusively to the Filipino people that the representative of the United States at Manila was the boss of the show, and that Aguinaldo was not, a demonstration then sorely needed by the exigencies of American prestige. The purpose can readily be appreciated, but to understand the plan of campaign and the method of its execution, somewhat of the geography of Luzon must now be considered before we approach the shores of Luzon and the city of Manila. However, let us consider from a distance, in a bird's eye view, as it were, the relation of Luzon to the rest of the archipelago, so as to know, in a comprehensive way, what we are going out for to see. We may as well pause at this point, long enough to learn all we will ever need to know, for the purposes of the scope of this narrative, concerning the general geography of the Philippine archipelago, and the governmental problems it presents. See folding map at end of volume. It is a common saying that Paris is France, in the same sense Manila is the Philippines. In fact, the latter expression is more accurate than the former, for Manila, besides being the capital city of the country, and its chief port, is a city of over 200,000 people, while no one of the 2 or 3 cities next to it in rank in population had more than 20,000. 235. By 30 of reasoning it may be said that Luzon was the Philippines, so far as the problem which confronted us when we went. There was concern, relatively both to the original conception in 1898 of the struggle for independence, its birth in 1899, its life, and its slow, lingering obstinate death in 1900 to 1902, in which last year the insurrection was finally correctly stated to be practically ended. To know just how and why this was true is necessary to a clear understanding of that struggle, including not only its genesis and its exodus, but also its gospels, its acts, its revelations, and the multitudinous subsequent commentaries thereon. The total land area of the Philippine archipelago, according to the American Census of 1903, is 115,000 square miles, 236. The area of Luzon, the principal island on which Manila is situated, is 41,000 square miles, and that of Mindanao, the only other large island, is 36,237. Between these two large islands, Luzon on the north and Mindanao on the south, there are a number of smaller ones, but acquaintance with only 6 of these is essential to a clear understanding of the American occupation. Many Americans too busy to have paid much attention to the Philippine Islands, which are, and must ever remain, a thing wholly apart from American life, have a vague notion that there are several thousand of them. This is true. In a way, American energy has made, for the first time in their history, an actual count of them, including everything which appears as a separate island. 238. The work was done for our census of 1903 by M.R. George R. Putnam, now head of the Lighthouse Board of the United States. M.R. Putnam counted 31 of them, 239. Of these, of course, many hundred perhaps, are merely rocks fit only for a resting place for birds. 2775 have an area of less than a square mile each. 262 have an area of between 1 and 10 square miles. 73 between 10 and 100 square miles. 20 between 100 and 1,000 square miles. This accounts for, and may dismiss at once from consideration 3130, all but 11. Most of these 3130s are large enough for the man to even so much as a single word here are formally opposite to human habitation, being, in most instances, without good harbors or overlanding places, and usually covered either with dense jungle or inhospitable mountains, or both. Their total area is only about 8,500 square miles of the 115,500 square miles of land in the archipelago. None of them have ever had any political significance either in Spain's time or our own, and, therefore, the whole 3130 may at once be eliminated from consideration, leaving the 11 only requiring any special notice at all. The 11 largest islands of these, Luzon and Mindanao, have already been mentioned. The remaining 9, with their respective areas and populations, are Island area 240, population 241 in square miles. Panay 4,611, 743,646. Negros 4,881, 560,776. Sable 1,762, 592,247. Bohol 1,411, 243,148. Samar 5,031, 222,690. Leyte 2,722, 242, 357,641. Mindoro 3,851, 28,361. Mesbos 1,236, 29,451. Brava 4,027, 243, 10,918. Total 29,532, 2,788,878. The political or governmental problem being now reduced from 3141 islands to 11. Lastly, the 9 contained in the above table may also be eliminated as follows. See map at end of volume. Fragua, the long narrow island seen at the extreme lower left of any map of the archipelago, extending northeast-southwest at an angle of about 45 degrees, is practically roadless, being fit for nothing much, except a penal colony, for which purpose it is in fact now used. Mesbate, easily located on the map at a glance, because the 12th parallel of north latitude intersects the 124th meridian of longitude, east of Greenwich in its southeast corner, though noted for cattle and other quadrupeds, is not essential to a clear understanding of the human problem in its broader governmental aspects. Mindoro, the large island just south of the main bulk of Luzon, pierced by the 121st meridian of longitude east of Greenwich, is thick with densely wooded mountains and jungle over a large part of its area, has a reputation of being very unhealthy, malarious, is also very sparsely settled, and does not now, nor has it ever, have any significance as a disturbing factor. 244. Eliminating Paragua, Masbate, and Mindoro is not essential to a substantially correct general idea of the strategic and governmental problems presented by the Philippine Islands. We have left, besides Luzon and Mindanao, nothing but the half-dozen islands which appear in marked in the above table: Panay, Negros, Cebu, Bohol, Samar, Leyte, with a total area of 20,500 square miles. Add these to Luzon's 41,000 square miles and Mindanao's 36,000, and you have the Philippine archipelagos we are to consider in this book, that is to say, 2 big islands. With the half-dozen little ones in between, the 8, having a total area of 97,500 square miles, of which the 2 big islands represent nearly 4/5, while the great Mohammedan island of Mindanao, near Borneo, with its 36,000 square miles to 125 of area, requires that the Philippine archipelago be described as stretching over more than 1,000 miles, from north to south. Still, inasmuch as Mindanao only contains about 500,000 people all told, 246, half them semi-civilized, 247, the governmental problem presents no more. The main problem of weather is evident. We are spreading enemies to the 7 million Christians of the other islands. The questions that have to be passed on by our Commissioner of Indian Affairs have to do with the tariff. Mindanao's 36,000 square miles constitute nearly a third of the total area of the Philippine archipelago, and more than that, fraction of the 97,500 square miles of territory to a consideration of which our attention is reduced by the process of elimination, above indicated. Turning over Mindanao to those crudely Mohammedan, semi-civilized Moros would indeed be like granting self-government to an Apache reservation under some local chief, as M.R. Roosevelt, in the campaign of 1900, ignorantly declared it would be to grant self-government to Luzon under Aguinaldo. 248. Furthermore, the Moros, so far as they can think, would prefer to owe allegiance to, and be entitled to recognition as subjects of, some great nation. 249. Again, because the Filipinos have no moral right to control the Moros, and could not if they would, the latter being fierce fighters and bitterly opposed to the thought of possible ultimate domination by the Filipinos, the most uncompromising advocate of the consent of the governed principle has not a leg to stand on, with regard to Mohammedan Mindanao. Hence I affirm that as to it, we have a distinct and separate problem, which cannot be solved in the lifetime of anybody now living, but it is a problem which need not in the least delay the advent of independence for the other 14/15ths of the inhabitants of the archipelago. 250. All Christians living on islands north of Mindanao. It is true that there are some Christian Filipinos on Mindanao, but in policing the Moros, our government would of course protect them from the Moros. If they did not like our government, they could move to such parts of the island as we might permit to be incorporated in an ultimate Philippine Republic, inasmuch as the 300,000 or so Moros of the Mohammedan island of Mindanao and the adjacent islets called Jolo, the Sulu archipelago, so-called, reigned over by the Sultan of comic opera fame, originally presented, as they will always present, a distinct and separate problem, and never did have anything new to do with the Philippine introduction of their customary cousins and co-religionists over in nearby Borneo, the task which confronted Omar root in the fall of 1899, to wit, the suppression of the Philippine introduction, subjugation of one big island, Luzon, containing half the population and one-third of the area of the archipelago, and 6 neighboring smaller ones, the Visayas Islands. And now let us concentrate our attention upon Luzon and Omar root, no doubt there, with infinite ease, in the fall of 1899, of the 7,600,000 people of the Philippines 251, almost exactly one half, i.e. 3,800,000, 252, live on Luzon, and these are practically all civilized. 253, it so happens that the political union which is Luzon and the other is the one which furnished the first American civil government for the Philippines. Violence, government, but it is half its native state of Ohio is 41,061 square miles in area, and Luzon is 40,969,254. Roughly speaking, Luzon may also be said to be about the size of Cuba, 255, though it is about twice as thickly populated as the latter, Cuba, having something over 2 million people to Luzon's nearly 4,256,000. By all Americans in the Philippines since our occupation, the island of Luzon is always indicated as consisting of two parts, to wit, northern Luzon, or that part north of Manila, and southern Luzon, the part south of Manila. The Great Central Plain of Luzon, lying just north of Manila, is known as the or the state of New Jersey, in the neighborhood of 7,000 square miles area 257, and, like Salvador, it contains a population of something over 1 million inhabitants. The area and population of the 5 provinces of this plain are, according to the Philippine census of 1903, as follows. Province area 258, S2, N, population 259, Pangasinan 1,193, 397,902, Pampanga 868, 223,754, Bulacan 1,173, 223,742, Tarlac 1,205, 135,107, Nueva Ecija 1,950, 134,147, 6,389, 1,114,652. Roughly speaking, the Central Plain comprising the above 5 provinces is bounded as follows: on the north by mountains and Lingayen Gulf, on the east by a coast range of mountains separating it from the Pacific Ocean, on the west by a similar range separating it from the China Sea, and on the south by Manila Bay and mountains. The Rio Grande, Pampanga flows obliquely across it in a southwesterly direction into Manila Bay, and near its western edge runs the railroad from Manila to Dagupan on Lingayen Gulf. Dagupan is 120 miles from Manila. This plain, held by a well-equipped insurgent army backed by the moral support of the whole population, became the theater of war as soon as the volunteers of 1899 began to arrive at Manila, the insurgent capital being then at Tarlac, a place about 2/3 of the way up the railroad from Manila to Dagupan. Of course, the first essential thing to do was to break the backbone of the insurgent army and scatter it, and the next thing to do was to capture Aguinaldo, the head in front of the whole business, the incarnation of the aspirations of the Filipino people. The operations to this end commenced in October and involved 3 movements of 3 separate forces. 1. A column under General Lawton, proceeding up the Rio Grande and along the northeastern borders of the plain, and then around westward along its northern boundary toward the Gulf of Lingayen, garrisoning the towns en route and occupying the mountain passes on the northeast which give exit over the divide into the great valleys beyond. 2. An expedition under General Wheaton, some 2,500 in all, proceeding by transports to the Gulf of Lingayen, the chief port of which, Dagupan, was the northern terminus of the railroad. The objective being to land on the shore of that gulf at the northwest corner of the plain, occupy the great coast road which runs from that point to the northern extremity of the island, and also to proceed eastward and effect a junction with the Lawton column. 3. A third column under General MacArthur, proceeding up the railroad to the capture of Tarlac, the third insurgent capital, and thence still up the railroad to its end at Dagupan, driving the enemy's forces before it toward the line held by the first 2 columns. On October 12th, General Lawton moved up the Rio Grande from a place called Ariat, a few miles upstream from where the railroad crosses the river at Calumpit, driving the insurgents before him to the northward and westward. His command was made up mainly from the 3D Cavalry and the 22D Infantry, together with several hundred scouts, American and McAdoo. On the 28th, San Isidro was again captured. That was the place Lawton had evacuated in the previous arrival on the islands, with Colonel E. Harding's regiment, the 29th U.S. Volunteer Infantry. On November 3, 1899, the rider was immediately detailed to the McAdoo Scouts to take the place of Lieutenant Boutal of the regular artillery, a young West Pointer from Oregon, who had been killed a day or two previous, and reported to Navy C.G. Star, General Lawton's adjutant general in the field, whom he had known at Santiago de Cuba the previous year, at San Isidro on or about November 8th. Navy Star said, "We took this town last spring, didn't have much or loss had been in so doing, but partly as a result of that, Sherman commissioned Harlan with the insurgents General Otis had us fall back. We have just had to take it again. General Lawton, garrison San Isidro, come one for all, and press on north, capturing successive towns en route. Meantime, General Young's cavalry and the McABB scouts under Major Batson, a lieutenant of the regular army and Medal of Honor graduate of the Santiago campaign, were operating to the west of the general line of advance, striking insurgent detachments wherever found and driving them toward the line of the railroad. On November 13, Lawton's advance had turned to the westward, according to the concerted plan of campaign above described, garrisoning as fast as they were taken such of the towns of the country over which he swept as there were troops to spare. 4. We knew that Aguinaldo had been at Tarlac when the advance began, and every officer and enlisted man of the command was on the qui-vive to catch him. By November 18, General Lawton's forces held a line of posts extending up the eastern side of the plain and curving around across the northern end to within a few miles of the Gulf of Lingayen. On November 6, General Wheaton set sail from Manila for Lingayen Gulf, with 2,500 men of the 13th Regular and 33d Volunteer Infantry, and a platoon of the 6th Artillery, convoyed by the ships of the Navy. And next day the expedition was successfully landed in Vivian, with effective assistance from the naval convoy against spirited resistance, says Secretary of War Root in his annual report for 1899. The Navy's assistance on that occasion was indeed effective, but such passing mention hardly covers the case. In the first place, they selected the landing point, their patrols being already familiar with the coast. As soon as the transports were sighted, about 11 o'clock on the morning of November 7, Commander Knox, the senior officer present, who commanded the Princeton, and Commander Moore of the Helena, went out to meet and confer with General Wheaton. This done, the landing was effected under protection of the Navy's guns. Besides the naval vessels above named, there were also present the Bennington under Commander Arnold, the Manila under Lieutenant Commander Nosro, and 2 captured Spanish gunboats small enough to get close inshore, the Callao and the Samar. The troops were disembarked in 2 columns of small boats towed by launches. Lieutenant Commander Tappan in charge of the Callao, and Anthony Mustard, commanding the Callao, were especially commended in the dispatches of Admiral Watson, Commander-in-Chief of the Asiatic Squadron. Those bombarded the insurgent trenches at close range during the landing, and Mustard actually steamed in between the insurgents and the head of the column of troop boats, so as to intercept and receive the brunt of their fire himself, and, selecting a point about 75 yards from the enemy's trenches, whence he could effectually cover them, ran his ship aground Fauché with stick, and commenced rapid firing at point-blank range, driving the enemy from its trenches, and enabling final clear of the 33d, and those who followed, to land without being subjected to further fire while on the water. 216. On the 11th of November, Colonel Moore with the 33d Volunteer Infantry, and 1 Gatling gun under Captain Charles R. Howland of the 28th Volunteer Infantry, a lieutenant of the regular army, and a member of General Wheaton's staff, proceeded southeastward to San Jacinto, and attacked and routed some 1,200 to 1,600 Major John Logan Benoit was killed. The enemy left 81 trenches, and suffered a total loss estimated at 300. While space does not permit dwelling on the details of engagements, it may be remarked here, once for all, that the 33d Volunteer Infantry, Colonel Luther R. Hare commanding, made more reputation than any other of the 25 regiments of the Volunteer Army of 1899, except, possibly, Colonel J. Franklin Bennett Regiment, the 36th. There is no reflection on the rest. These 2 were lucky enough to have more opportunities. In meeting with opportunities, However, Colonel Hare, like Colonel Bell, proved himself a superb soldier. His field officers, especially Major March 261, were particularly indefatigable. And his men were mostly Texans, accustomed to handling a rifle with effect. Space also forbids. Following Captain Howland and his Gatling gun into the engagement of November 11, but from the uniformity with which General Wheaton's official reports commend his young aide's bravery and efficiency on numerous occasions in 1899 to 1900, it may be safely assumed that those qualities were behind that Gatling gun at San Jacinto. There was a vicious rumor started after the San Jacinto fight and given wide circulation in the United States that Major Logan was shot in the back by his own men. I saw a major surgeon a few days later who had been an eyewitness to his death. He said an insurgent sharpshooter shot Major Logan from a tree, and that the said sharpshooter was promptly thereafter dropped from his perch full of 33D infantry bullets. Says General Wheaton's dispatch of November 12, Major Logan fell while gallantly leading his battalion, 262. On November 5th, General MacArthur, with a strong column, composed mainly of the 9th, 17th, and 36th regiments of infantry, 2 troops of the 4th Cavalry, 2 platoons of the 1st Artillery, and a detachment of scouts, advanced up the railroad from Angeles, in execution of his part of the program. 263, Angeles is some distance up the railroad from Columbia, where the railroad crosses the Rio Grande. 264, General MacArthur's columns encountered and overwhelmed the enemy at Woodley Point, entering Tonopah on November 12th, and effecting a junction with General Wheaton at Dagupan, the northern terminus of the Manila-Dagupan Railroad, 120 miles from Manila, on November 20th. After General Long had finished his part of the roundup, he had a final conference with General Young on November 18th in Toledo, which is in the Domestic and home, wave him goodbye, and soon afterward went south to dispose of a body of insurgents who were giving trouble near Manila. It was in this last expedition that he lost his life at San Mateo, about 12 miles out of Manila on December 19, 1899. The first of the 2 purposes of the Great Northern Offense, with the dispersion of the insurgent army of Northern Luzon, had been duly accomplished. The other purpose had failed of realization, such as in brief the story of the destruction of the Aguinaldo government in 1899 by General Otis, or rather by Amar Root. But the trouble about it was that it would not stay destroyed. It played possum for a while, the Honorable President retiring to permanent headquarters in the mountains with his government concealed out. His person, as Senator Lodge put it later in a summary of the case for the administration before the Senate in the spring of 1900, it was distinguished and distinguished senator from Massachusetts, in adding at that time to the Gaiety of Nations, had had access to a certain diary kept by one of Aguinaldo's personal staff throughout the period, subsequently submitted in 1902 to the Senate Committee of that year. He could have swelled the innocuous merriment with such cheery entries as "Here we tightened our belts and went to bed on the ground." The time alluded to being midnight after a hard day's march without food. The place, some chilly mountain topography. Honorable President and party had that day been guided by the ever-present and ever-willing persona, fellow countrymen, of the immediate neighborhood. Whatever the neighborhood, to facilitate them in eluding General Young's hard-riding cavalry and the writer has no quarrel with Senator Lodge's witticism above quoted, having derived on reading it, in full measure, the suggestive amusement it was intended to afford. It is true that about all then left of the Honorable President's government, for the nuns, was in fact concealed about his person. It was of a nature easily portable. It needed neither bull trains, pack ponies, nor coolies to carry it. It consisted solely of the loyal support of the whole people, who looked to him as the incarnation of their aspirations, said General MacArthur to the Senate Committee in 1902 concerning Aguinaldo. He was the incarnation of the feelings of the Filipinos. Senator Culberson, and represented the Filipino people. General MacArthur, I think so. Yes. 265. we of the 8th Army Corps did not know what a complete structure the Philippine Republic of 1898 September was until, having shot it to pieces, we had abundant leisure to examine the ruins, to admit, in the same breath, participation in that war and profound regret that it ever had occurred, is not an incriminating admission, in this case, as in any other where you have done another a wrong, by thrashing him, or otherwise, under a mistake of fact. The first step toward righting the wrong is to frankly acknowledge it. As soon as Aguinaldo's flight and wanderings terminated in the finding of permanent headquarters, he began sending messages to his various generals all over Luzon and the other islands, and wherever those orders were not intercepted they were delivered and fully obeyed. This kept up until General Funston captured him in 1901. One traitor among all those teeming millions might have betrayed his whereabouts, but none appeared. The obstinate character and long continuance of the warfare in northern Luzon after the Great Roundup, which terminated with the final junction of the Lawton, Wheaton, and MacArthur columns near Dagupan, as elsewhere, later throughout the archipelago, was at first very surprising to our generals. It had been supposed that to disperse the insurgent army would end the insurrection. As events turned out, it only made the resistance more effective, so long as the insurgents kept together. In large bodies they could not hide, and as they were poor marksmen, while the men behind our guns, like most other young Americans, knew something about shooting, the ratio of their casualties to ours was about 16 to 1. 266. When General MacArthur began his advance on Tarlac, General Lawton his great march up the valley of the Rio Grande, and General Wheaton his closing in from Dagupan, Aguinaldo, with his cabinet, generals, and headquarters troops abandoned Tarlac, their capital, and went up the railroad to Bayan-Bang. Here they held a council of war, which General MacArthur describes in his report for 1900, from information obtained later on, as follows. At a council of war held at Bayan-Bang, Pangasinan, about November 12, 1899, which was attended by General Aguinaldo and many of the Filipino military leaders, a resolution was adopted to the effect that the insurgent forces were incapable of further resistance in the field, and as a consequence it was decided to disband the army, the generals and the men to return to their own provinces, with a view to organizing the people for general resistance by means of guerrilla warfare. 267. This had been the plan from the beginning, the Council of War, simply determining that the time to put the plan into effect had arrived. Accordingly, the uniformed insurgent battalions and regiments broke up into small bands which maintained a most persistent guerrilla warfare for years thereafter. During those years they seldom wore uniforms, disappearing and hiding their guns when hotly pursued, and reappearing as non-combatant peasants interrupted in agricultural pursuits, with invariable protestations of friendship. Hence all such came to be known as amigos, friends, and the word amigo, or friend, became a bitter byword, meaning to all American soldiers throughout the archipelago an enemy falsely claiming to be a friend, and every Filipino was an amigo. Still, the volunteers had arrived in time to enable M.R. Root to make a very nice showing to Congress, and through it to the people, in his annual report to the President for 1899, dated November 29. This report is full of cheerful chirps from General Otis to the effect that the resistance was practically ended, and the substance of the information it conveyed duly found its way into the President's message of December of that year and through it to the general public. One of the Otis dispatches said, "Claim to government by insurgents can be made no longer." 268. This message went on to state that nothing was now left but banditti, and that the people are all friendly to our troops. Thus misled, M.R. Root repeated to the President and, through him to Congress and the country, the following nonsense. It is gratifying to know that as our troops got away from the immediate vicinity of Manila they found the natives of the country exceedingly friendly. This was doubtless due in some measure to the fact that the Pampangos, who inhabit the provinces of Pampanga and Tarlac, and the Pangasinans, who inhabit Pangasinan, as well as the other more northerly tribes, are unfriendly to the Tagalogs, and had simply submitted to the military domination of that tribe, from which they were glad to be relieved. In characterizing this as nonsense, no disrespect is intended to M.R. Root. He did not know any better. He was relying on General Otis. But it is sorely difficult to convey in written words what utter nonsense those expressions about the Pangangos and the Pangasinenes are to anyone who was in that northern advance in the fall of 1899. Imagine the British cabinet minister making a report to Parliament in 1776 couched in the following words, to wit: the Massachusettsites, who inhabit Massachusetts, and the Virginiaites who inhabit Virginia, as well as most of the other inhabitants, are unfriendly to the New Yorkites, and have simply submitted to the military domination of the last named. And you have a faint idea of the accuracy of M.R. Root's report. It is quite true that the Tagalos were the prime movers in the insurrection against us, as they had been in all previous insurrections against Spain, but the Tagalo tribe was no more alone among the Filipino people in their wishes and views than the unterrified Tammany tribe, who inhabit the wilds of Manhattan Island, at the mouth of the Hudson River, are alone in their views among our people. On page 70 of this report, Secretary Root reproduces a telegram from General Otis dated November 18, 1899, stating that on the road from San Nicolas to San Manuel, a day or so previous, General Lawton was cordially received by the inhabitants. He announces in the same telegram the drowning of Captain Luna, a volunteer officer from New Mexico, who was one of General Lawton's aides, and had been a captain in Colonel Roosevelt's regiment of Rough Riders before Santiago. The rider happens to have been on that ride with General Lawton from San Nicolas to San Manuel, and was within a dozen feet of Captain Luna, when the angry current of the Ano River caught him and his pony in its grip and swept both out of his sight forever, along with divers, troopers of the 4th Cavalry, horses and riders writhing to their death in one awful, tangled, struggling mass. He can never forget the magnificent dash back into the wide, ugly, swollen stream made by Captain Edward L. King of General Lawton's staff, as he spurred his horse in, followed by several troopers who had responded to his call for mounted volunteers to accompany him in an effort to save the lives of the men who went down. Their generous work proved futile, but it was inspired partly by common dread of what they knew would happen to any half-drowned soldier who might be washed ashore far away from the column uncaptured. If an army was ever in enemy's country, it was then and there. When we reached San Manuel that night, Captains King and Sewell, the 2 surviving personal aides of General Lawton's staff, and the rider, stopped, along with the general, in a little, neat shack on the roadside. General Lawton was in an upper room busy with couriers and the like, but downstairs King, Sewell, and myself set to work to bus guard 269, something to eat. I got hold of an hombre, literally, a man, colloquially a native peasant man, who went to work with apparent alacrity, and managed to provide 3 ravenously hungry young men with a good meal of chicken, eggs, and rice after supper. Being new in the country, the writer remarked to the general on the alacrity of the hombre. I had brought out from the United States the notions there current about the nature of the resistance. General Lawton said, with a humorous twinkle in those fine eyes of his, "Humph. If you expected to be killed the next minute if you didn't find a chicken, you'd probably find one too." It is true that in the course of the campaign General Young sent a telegram to General Otis at Manila characterizing his reception at the hands of the natives as friendly. This was prompted by our column being met as it would come into a town by the town band. It did not take long to see through this and other like hypocrisy entirely justifiable in war, though such tactics deceived us for a little while at first into thinking the people were genuine amigos, friends. General Otis, not being near the scene, remained under our original brief illusion. Let us return, however, from M.R. Root's patient and unconsenting millions dominated by the Tagalo tribe of 1899 to the facts, and follow the course of events succeeding Lawton's junction with Wheaton and MacArthur, and his farewell to Young. General Young, with his cavalry and the Macabebe scouts, continued in pursuit of Aguinaldo through the passes of the mountains, the latter having managed to run the gauntlet of our lines successfully, by a very close shave. How narrowly he escaped is illustrated by the fact that after a fight we had at the Iringi River on November 19, in which Major Batson was wounded while gallantly directing the crossing of the river, we remained that night in the town of Iringi, and at the very time we were hustling for chow in Iringi, Aguinaldo was in the village of Nagilian, an hour or so distant, as was authoritatively ascertained long afterward from a captured diary of one of his staff officers. 270. General Young proceeded up the coast road, in hot haste, taking one town, San Fernando de Union. After a brief engagement led by the general in person, imagine the brigadier general leading a charge, at the head of 37 men. But Aguinaldo had turned off to the right and taken to the mountains. General Lawton marked General Otis about that time, in effect, in announcing Aguinaldo's escape, through our lines and his own tireless brigade commander's bold dash, in pursuit of him with an inadequate force of cavalry hampered by lack of horseshoes and nails for the save. If Young does not catch Aguinaldo, he will at least make him very unhappy. The Young column garrisoned the towns along the route over which it went, occupying all the western part of northern Luzon, hereafter described, and also, later on rescued. Lieutenant Gilmore of the Navy, M.R. Albert Sonicson, previously an enlisted man and since a writer of some note, and other American prisoners who had been in the hands of the insurgents for many months. General Young finally made his headquarters at Vigan, in the province of Ilocos, a fine town in a fine country. The Ilocanos are called the Yankees of the Philippines, on account of their energy and industry. Vigan is on the China Sea coast of Luzon, the west coast, about 100 miles up the old Spanish coast road, or King's Highway, Camino Real, from Lingayen Gulf, where the 120-mile railroad from Manila to Dagupan ends, and about 80 miles from the extreme northern end of the island of Luzon. 271. As subsequent policies and their effect on one's attitude toward a great historic panorama do not interfere in the least with a proper appreciation of the bravery and efficiency of the army of one's country, it is with much regret that this narrative cannot properly chronicle in detail what the War Department reports record of the stirring deeds of General Young and the officers and men of his command, Colonels Hare and House, Captains Chase and Dodd, and the rest. 272. Performed during the long course of the war now under consideration. One incident, however, is appropriate in this connection, not only to a collection of genre pictures of the war itself, but also to a place among the lights and shadows of the general picture of the American occupation. On December 2, 1899, Major March of the 33d Infantry had his famous fight at Tila Pass, in which young Gregorio del Pilar, one of the ablest and bravest of the insurgent generals, was killed. The locality mentioned is a wild pass in the mountains of the west coast of Luzon that overlook the China Sea, some 4,500 feet above sea level. It was strongly fortified and was believed by the insurgents to be impregnable. The trail winds up the mountains in a sharp zigzag and was commanded by a stone barricade loophole for infantry fire. The advance of our people was checked at first by a heavy fire from these barricades, the approach being precipitous. It looked for a while as if the position would indeed be impregnable, and the idea of taking it by a frontal attack was abandoned, but a hill to the left front of the barricade was seized by some of our sharpshooters. Those Texans of the 33d were indeed sharpshooters, and, after that, under cover of their fire, our troops managed to get in a fire simultaneously both on the flank and rear of the occupants of the barricades, climbing the precipitous slope up the mountainside by means of twigs and the like, and finally killing some 52 of the enemy, General Pilar among the number. After the fight was over, Lieutenant Quinlan, heretofore mentioned, moved by certain indignities in the nature of looting perpetrated upon the remains of General Pilar, buried them with such military honors as could be hastily provided, after first taking from a pocket of the dead general's uniform a souvenir in the shape of an unfinished poem written in Spanish by him the night before, addressed to his sweetheart. And, the burial finished, the American officer placed on the rude headstone left to mark the spot this generous inscription. General Gregorio Pilar, killed at the Battle of Tila Pass, December 2, d. 1899, commanding Aguinaldo's rearguard, and Officer and a gentleman, signed, D. P. Quinlan, 2D Lieutenant, 11th Cavalry. The brief incident over, Quinlan hurried on, rejoined the column, and resumed the work of benevolent assimilation and the war against Home Rule with all the dauntless ardor of his impetuous Irish nature. Whatever the ultimate analysis of the ethics of this scene, Quinlan at the grave of Pilar, clearly the second lieutenant, Quinlan of 1899 would hardly have agreed with the vice presidential candidate of 1900, Colonel Roosevelt, that granting self-government to the Filipinos would be like granting self-government to an Apache reservation under some local chief. The territory occupied and finally pacified by General Young, with the effective assistance of the officers heretofore mentioned, and many other good men and true, was ultimately organized into a military district, which was called the 1st District of the Department of Northern Luzon, as territory was fought over, occupied, and finally reduced to submission. That territory would be organized into a military district by the commanding general or colonel of the invading column, under the direction of the division commander, the Military Division of the Philippines, which was succeeded by the civil government of the Philippines under Governor Taft. In 1901, of course, covered all the territories ceded by the Treaty of Paris. It was divided into 4 departments: the Department of Northern Luzon, the Department of Southern Luzon, the Department of the Visayas, 273, and the Department of Mindanao and Jolo. General Young commanded the 1st District of the Department of Northern Luzon, which included the 3 West Coast provinces north of Lingayen Gulf, and the 3 adjacent mountain provinces. From the time he led his brigade into that region in pursuit of Aguinaldo until shortly before Governor Taft's inauguration in the summer of 1901, many were the combats, great and small, of General Young's brigade, encompassing the task of crushing the resistance in that part of Luzon into which he led the first American troops in the winter of 1899 to 1900. The resistance was obstinate, desperate, and long drawn out, but when he finally reported the territory under his command pacified, it was pacified. A soldier's task had been performed in a soldierly manner. The work had been done thoroughly. General Young gave the Ilocano country a lesson it never forgot. Before politics had time to interfere, we have never had any trouble in that region from that day to this. Before the Army of Occupation had had time to do in southern Luzon what General Young did in northern Luzon and thereby secure like permanent results in that region, a peace at any price policy was inaugurated to meet the exigencies of M.R. McKinley's campaign for the presidency in 1900. Our last martyred president clung all through that campaign to his original assumption that benevolent assimilation would work, and that the single burning need of the hour was to make clear to the Filipinos what our intentions were, as if powder and lead did not spell denial of independence. Plain enough, as if that were not the sole issue, and as if that issue had not been submitted, with deadly finality, to the stern arbitrament of war. However, neither Lord Roberts in India, nor Lord Kitchener in Egypt ever more effectively convinced the people of those countries that his flag must be respected as an emblem of sovereignty than General Young did. The Ilocanos, take the month of April, 1900 for instance, several days after the expiration of said month, on May 5, General Otis was relieved and went home. During the month of April, General Young killed 500 insurgents in his district, 274, but this did not prevent General Otis arriving as he did in the United States in the month of June, when the national political conventions meet, from repeating the same old story about the insurrection going to pieces. 275, only, not going now, but gone, nor did it, and like sputterings of insurrection all over the place, prevent Judge Taft, the Mark Taftling of this Philippine business, as he humorously told the Senate Committee of 1902 he had been called from cabin home. During the presidential campaign of 1900, a series of superlatively optimistic Bulletins, 276, based on the testimony of Filipinos who had abandoned the cause of their country as soon as patriotism meant personal peril. All such testimony being eagerly accepted, as testimony of the kind one wants and needs badly usually is, in total disregard of information, directly to the contrary furnished by General MacArthur and other distinguished soldiers who had been then on the ground for 2 years. The area and population of the territory occupied by General Young, the 1st District of the Department of Northern Luzon, was, according to the census of 1903, as follows. Province area, SQ-M, 277 population 278. Ilocos North 1,330 178,995, Ilocos Sur 471 187,411, Union 634 137,839, Abra 1,171 51,860, Lapano Bontoc 279 2,570 2,750, Benguet 822 22,745. 6,433 651,600. As this narrative purpose is so to present the geography of the Philippine Islands as to facilitate an easy remembrance of the essentials only of the governmental problem there presented, we will hereafter speak of the 1st District as containing, roughly, 6,500 square miles, and 650,000 people, whenever, if ever, a Philippine Republic is set up. These 6 provinces are very likely, for geographical and other reasons, to become one of the original states comprising the Republic, just as the states of Mexico are made up of groups of provinces, 280. The rest of the story of the Northern Campaign of 1899 to 1900 immediately following Aguinaldo's escape into the mountains through General Young's and General Lawton's lines, being a necessary part of the American occupation of the Philippines, may also serve as a text for further acquainting the reader with the geography of Luzon. War is the best possible teacher of geography, and it may be well to communicate, in broken doses, as we receive them, the lessons on this subject, which the 8th Army Corps learned in 1899 and the subsequent years, so thoroughly, that we could all pronounce with astonishing glibness the most unpronounceable names imaginable. When the great Wheaton Lawton MacArthur roundup reached the mountains on the northeast of the Great Central Plain, in the latter part of November 1899, Captain Joseph B. Batchelor, with 1 battalion of the 24th Negro Infantry, and some scouts under Lieutenant Kastner, a very intrepid and tireless officer, boldly cut loose from the column of which he was a part, and, pressing on over the Caraglan Pass, overran the province of Nueva Vizcaya, which is part of the watershed of north-central Luzon, proceeding from Bayambang, the capital of Nueva Vizcaya, down the valley of the Magid River, by the same route Messrs. Wilcox and Sergeant of the Navy had made their pleasant junket in the fall of 1898 as described in Chapter 6. Following this route, Captain Batchelor finally came into Isabela Province, where the Magid empties into the Cagayan River, reaching Iligan, the capital of Isabela, 90 miles northeast of Bayambang, about December 8. From Iligan, Batchelor went on, promptly, overcoming all resistance offered, down the Great Cagayan Valley, some 110 miles due north, to the Sea Adiperi, the northernmost town of Luzon and of the archipelago, where he met 2 vessels of our Navy, the Newark and the Helena, under Captain McCalla, and found, to his inexpressible, but partially and rather fervently expressed, chagrin, that the insurgents who had fled before him, and also the garrison, at Adiperi, had already surrendered to the Navy. The territory thus covered by Batchelor's bold, brilliant, and memorable march over 200 miles of hostile country from the mountains of central Luzon, down the Cagayan Valley to the northern end of the island, Adiperi, 281, consisted of the 3 provinces of Cagayan, Isabela, and Nueva Vizcaya. The area and population of these 3, according to the census tables of 1903, are as follows. Province area, SQ, M, 282 population 283. Cagayan 5,052 156,239, Isabela 5,018 76,431, Nueva Vizcaya 1,950 62,541, total 12,295,211. The troops of Captain Batchelor's command were later on relieved by 5th 16th Infantry, commanded by Colonel Hood, under whom the above group of 3 provinces finally became the 2nd District. Department of Northern Luzon, as part of the plan to provide the reader with a fair general idea of Luzon conveniently portable in memory, he is requested to note, at this point, that hereinafter the Cagayan Valley, with its 3 provinces, 284, will be alluded to as a district containing 12,000 square miles and 300,000 people, as was remarked concerning the original military district commanded by General Young, to wit, the 1st District, so of Colonel Hood's district, the 2nd, that is to say, as the Ilocano country may someday become the state of Ilocos, so, for like geographical and other governmental reasons, the 3 provinces of the Cagayan Valley may someday become the state of Cagayan in the possible Philippine Republic of the future. Having now followed the far-flung battle lines of Longline and their comrades in arms, the regulars, from Manila northward, across the rice paddies of central Luzon and over the mountains to the northern extremity of the island, let us return to the Central Plain, for reasons which will be stated in so doing, between the China Sea and the coast range which forms the western boundary of the Central Plain of Luzon. There is a long strip of territory, or western of the plain, as it were, about 125 miles long, with an average width of not more than 20 miles, stretching from Manila Bay to Lingayen Gulf. This is divided, for governmental purposes, into 2 provinces, the China and the South, the southern extremity beyond Admiral Jones, both sides as he entered Manila Bay the night before the naval battle of May 1st, 1898, and Zambales on the north. The area and population of this territory are as follows. Province area, SQ, population. Bataan 537 46,787, Zambales 2,125 104,549, 2,662 151,336. Also, between the Pacific Ocean and the coast range which form the eastern boundary of the plain is a longer, narrower, and very sparsely populated strip, or east wing, divided also into 2 provinces, Principe on the north and Infanta on the south. Each of those states, containing about 15,000 people, Principe and Infanta are wholly unimportant, except that, to avoid confusion, we must account for all the provinces visible on the maps of Luzon. These 2 provinces never gave any trouble and no one ever bothered about them. 285, in the mountains of Zambales and Bataan. However, as in most of the other provinces of the archipelago, this struggle was long kept up, just as the Boers kept up their war for independence against Great Britain about the same time, by guerrilla warfare. The Central Plain with 5 provinces has already been fully described. If to this plain you add its 2 wings, above mentioned, you have the 9 provinces of Central Luzon you see on the map, and, if to them you add the 6 provinces of the Ilocos country and the 3 of the Cagayan Valley, you have clearly before you the political makeup of Northern Luzon, 18 provinces in all, when Central Luzon was arranged by districts under the military occupation. It was divided into 3 parts, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th districts of the Department of Northern Luzon. The 3rd district, being under General Jacob H. Smith of Samar fame, 286. The 4th, under General Funston, and the 5th under General Grant. The 6th, and last district of Northern Luzon was made up of the city of Manila, and adjacent territory. General Smith's district, the 3rd, comprised the provinces of Province Area, SQ.M. Population Zambales 2,125 104,549, Pangasinan 1,193 397,902, Tarlac 1,205 135,107, 4,523 637,558. Pangasinan with its near 400,000 people is the largest, in point of population, of the 25 provinces of Luzon, and the 3rd, largest of the archipelago. General Funston's district, the fourth, comprised the provinces of Province Area, SQ.M. Population Waifa Esija 2,169 134,147, Principi 287 331 15,853, 2,500 150,000. General Grant's district, the fifth, comprised the provinces of Province Area, SQ.M. Population Bataan 537 46,787, Pampanga 868 223,754, Bulacan 1,173 223,742, 2,578 494,283, 2,500 150,000, totals, 4th and 5th districts, 5,078 644,283. It will be seen from the foregoing that the 3rd district was nearly equal in area to the 4th and 5th added together, and that the same was true as to its population figure. Just as the 6 provinces of the Ilocano country, first occupied by General Young and organized as the 1st district of the Department of Northern Luzon, should someday evolve into a state of Ilocos, and the 3 provinces of the Cagayan Valley, occupied by Colonel Hood as the 2nd district, into an ultimate state of Cagayan, so the provinces of General Smith's old district, the 3rd, should finally become a state of Pangasinan, 288. This 3rd district may be conveniently recollected as accounting for, roughly speaking, 4,500 square miles of territory and 625,000 people, the total combined area of General Funston's old district, the 4th, 289, and the adjacent one, the 5th, General Grant's district, is roughly 5,000 square miles, and its total population 650,000. No reason is apparent why these 2 districts, the 4th and 5th, should not ultimately evolve into a state of Pampanga, the 5 original military districts, 290, which, in 1900 constituted all of the Department of Northern Luzon except the city of Manila and vicinity, might make 4 ultimate states, with names, areas, and populations as follows. State Area SQ.M. Population Ilocos 6,500 650,000, Cagayan 12,300,000, Pangasinan 4,500 625,000, Pampanga 5,650,000, 28,000 2,225,000. It may surprise the reader after all the blood and thunder to which his attention has here and above been subjected, apropos of Northern Luzon and the winter of 1899 to 1900, to know that the insurgents were still bearding the lion in his den, i.e. General Otis in Manila, by operating in very considerable force in the village-dotted country, within cannon shot of the road from Manila to Cavite in January 1900. Nevertheless, such was the case. On the 4th of January, 1900, General J.C. Bates was assigned to the command of the 1st Division of the 8th Army Corps, General Lawton's old division, and an active campaign was commenced in southern Luzon. The plan adopted was that General Wheaton with a strong force should engage and hold the enemy in the neighborhood of Cavite, while General Schwan, starting at the western horn of the Half Moon to which the great lake called Laguna de Bay has already been likened, should move rapidly down the west shore of the lake and around its south shore to Santa Cruz near its eastern end, or horn, garrisoning the towns en route as taken, instead of leaving them to be reoccupied by the insurgents. Santa Cruz is the same place where General Lawton had touched second base, as it were, with a flying column in April 1899. This plan was duly carried out. The Schwan column started from San Pedro Makati, the initial rendezvous, a few miles out of Manila, on January 4, 1900, now garrisoning the towns en route, instead of leaving them to be fought over and captured again as heretofore. The first step fight we had in that campaign was at Binan, on January 6, 1900, one of the places General Lawton's expedition had taken when he fought his way over the same country the year before. O.K. Davis and John T. McCutcheon, who were in that fight and campaign. In fact, One of them had the ice-cold nerve to photograph the Biden fight while it was going on, as I learned when we all went down to the creek near the town after we took it to freshen up. Can testify that we did not then hear any nonsense about a Tegel insurrection, such as Secretary of War Root's report for 1899, published shortly before, is full of, and that on the contrary the whole country was as much a unit against us and as loyal to the Aguinaldo government as Northern Luzon had been, and inasmuch as I am doing some testifying along here myself, and assuming to brush aside without the slightest hesitation, as wholly erroneous information conveyed to the American public at the time, in the state papers of President McKinley and Secretary of War Root, it is only due the reader, whose attention is being seriously asked, that the witness should qualify as to the opportunities he may have had, if any, to know whereof he speaks. Concerning the character of the opposition, to that end, the following document, which General Schwan was kind enough to send me afterwards, is submitted as send. Extract copy. Headquarters Detachment Macabebe Scouts, the Adjutant General, Schwan's Expeditionary Brigade. Sir, I have the honor to submit the following report of the operations of the detachment of Macabebe Scouts, under my command, while forming a part of your brigade. The detachment, consisting of 5 officers and 140 men, was divided into 2 companies, commanded by 1st LT, J. Lee Ho, 33rd Infant 1st LT, Blount, 29th Inf. Left San Pedro Makati the afternoon of Jan. 4th, 1900. I wish to invite your attention, especially, to the good work done in the fight at Binan Bilaut, Blount, 29th Inf. who led the line by at least 25 yards. Very respectfully, W.M. C. Geiger, 1st LT, 14th Inf. Comdictet. I hereby certify that the above is a true copy of extracts from the report of the operations of the detachment of Macabebe Scouts, forming part of an expeditionary brigade under my command, in the months of January and February, 1900. Theo Schwan, Brig. General, U.S. Vols. Aug. 16, 1900. The activities of Generals Bates and Wheaton, and the Schwan expedition, of January-February, 1900, extended the American occupation, so far, as there were troops enough immediately available to go around, over, the lakeshore portions and the principal towns of the 2 great provinces of southern Luzon bordering on the Laguna de Bay, viz., Cavite and Laguna, and over parts of the 2 adjacent provinces of Batangas and Tebas. Batangas bounds Cavite on the south, and is itself bounded on the south by the sea, where a fairly good port offered a fine gateway for smuggling arms into the interior from abroad. Tebas Province adjoined Laguna on the southeast. Cavite Province has always been, since the opening of the Suez Canal, about 1869, and the agitations for political reform in Spain which culminated in the Spanish Republic of 1873, quickened the thought of Spain's East Indies, the home of insurrection, the breeding place of political agitation. Aguinaldo himself was born within its limits. In 1869, Laguna Province comprehends most of the country lying between the southern and eastern lakeshore of the Laguna de Bay and the mountains which skirt that body of water, in the blue distance, all parts of it being thus in easy and safe touch by water transportation by night with Cavite, the home and headquarters of insurgency. Just as northern Luzon had been gradually organized into military districts as conquered, so was southern Luzon, the territory, overrun, as above described, by Generals Bates, Wheaton, and Schwan, was divided into 2 districts. 291, Colonel Hare commanded the 1st district, Cavite Province and vicinity. General Hull commanded the 2nd district, Batangas, Laguna, and Tebas. The area and population of these 4 provinces, according to the census of 1903, were as follows. Province area, SQ.M. Population. Cavite 134,779, Batangas 1,201 257,715, Laguna 629 148,606, Batabas 5,993 153,065 8,442 694,165. For convenience of subsequent allusion, this group of provinces may be treated as representing roughly 8,500 square miles of territory and 700,000 people. These four provinces group themselves together, naturally from a military standpoint, as physical force is a final basis of all government. These four provinces constitute a logical administrative governmental unit, as shown by the action of our military authorities in their extension of the American occupation. It would seem therefore that if there should ever be a Philippine Republic, they would probably constitute one of its states, the state, let us say, of Cavite. The rest of southern Luzon below that part above described consists of a peninsula which, owing to its odd formation, is easy to remember. The mainland of Luzon, that is to say, that part of the island which our narrative has already covered, remotely suggests, in shape, the state of Illinois. At least it resembles Illinois more than it does any other state of our Union, in that its length runs north and south, and its average length and width are nearer that of Illinois than any other. At the southeast corner of this mainland, the observer of the map will see, jutting off to the southeast from the mainland, the peninsula in question. It is about 150 miles long, with an average width of possibly 30 miles, a minimum width of, say, 10 miles, and a maximum of 50, and is separated from Samar by the narrow, swift, and treacherous San Bernardino Strait, which connects the Pacific Ocean with the China Sea. This peninsula is frequently called the Hemp Peninsula. The importance of controlling the hemp ports prompted General Otis to send General Bates with an expedition to those ports on February 15, 1900. 292. This expedition did little more than occupy those ports. The great interior continued under insurgent control. Sometime afterward, the report of the Secretary of War, M.R. Root, for 1900, goes on to describe an engagement, or two, sustained by the Bates expedition shortly after it landed, and concludes with a complacency almost Otis-like, by stating that shortly thereafter, the normal conditions of industry and trade relations with Manila were resumed by the inhabitants. Of course M.R. Root believed this, and so did M.R. McKinley. More the pity, as we shall later see. General Otis was now getting anxious to go home, and hastened to occupy and organize the rest of the archipelago, on paper, at least, the Hemp Peninsula becoming, on March 20, 1900, the 3rd District of the Department of Southern Luzon. Brigadier General James M. Bell, commanding the provinces comprised in this district, with their areas and populations as given by the census of 1903, were as follows. Province area, SQ.M. Population: Camarines 293 3,279 239,405, Albay 1,783 240,326, Sorsogon 755 120,495, 5,817 600,226. For convenience of subsequent allusion, these three provinces of the Hemp Peninsula, which constituted the 3rd Military District of the Military Department of Southern Luzon in 1900, may be regarded as comprising, roughly, 6,000 square miles of territory and 600,000 people. If the Philippine Republic of the future, which is the dream of the Filipino people, prove other than an idle dream, the Hemp Peninsula will probably someday constitute a state of that republic, an appropriate and probable name for which would be the state of Camarines. The 4th District of Southern Luzon, there were but 4, was occupied by the 29th U.S. Volunteer Infantry, commanded by Colonel E. Pardon, one of the best executive officers General Otis had in his whole command. The 4th District comprised a lot of islands, unnecessary to be considered at length in this bird's eye view of the panorama, but necessary to be mentioned in outlining the military occupation. The 29th, like the other 24 volunteer regiments, settled down in equanimity to the business of policing a hostile country. Sang with zest, like the rest of the 25 volunteer regiments, that old familiar song, Damn, damn, damn the Filipino. etc., and waited within the admirable stoicism of the American soldier for the season of their home going to roll round, which, under the Act of Congress 294, would be the spring of the following year. In Volume I Part 5, War Department Report, 1899, at pages 5 etc., may be found a journal illustrating the nature of the police work done by the volunteers of 1899 and 1900, and at pages 5 etc. of the same report for 1900, Volume I Part 4, may be found a similar diary carried up to June 30, 1901, throughout the period covered by those reports. Scarcely a day passed without what the military folk coolly call contacts with the enemy. The Visayas Islands were in course of time duly organized, as Luzon had previously been, departmentally and by military districts. The Visayan Islands became the Department of Luzon, divided into districts, commanded either by regimental commanders having a regiment or more with them, or by general officers. For a long time no attempt to make military occupation effective in these various islands, save in the coast towns, was attempted. However, the indicated disposition of troops completed, technically at least, the American occupation of the Visayan Islands. Pursuant to the small island, as we have hitherto followed them, Army first throughout northern Luzon and later through southern Luzon, some data are now in order concerning the Visayan Islands. As already made clear, there are but 6 of the Visayan Islands with which anyone interested in world politics or ethnic we need bother. The area and population of these are as follows: 295. Island Korea, SQ, N, population. Negroes 4,881, 460,776. Cebu 1,762, 592,247. Lake 2,722, 356,631. Stellar 5,031, 222,090. Boho 1,441, 243,148. Whenever, if ever, an independent republic is established in the Philippines, the 6 islands above mentioned could and should constitute self-governing commonwealths similar to the several states of the American Union. The rest of the islands lying between Luzon and Mindanao could easily be disposed of governmentally by being attached to the jurisdiction of one of the said 6 islands. Mindanao and the adjacent islets called Jolo were organized as the Department of Mindanao and Jolo, under General Cobb, with the 31st Volunteer Infantry, Colonel Pettit's Regiment, the 40th Volunteer Infantry, Colonel Godwin's Regiment, and the 23rd Regular Infantry. Thus the archipelago was completely accounted for the time being, just as all the territory of the United States was long accounted for by our military authorities at home, with the Department of the East, headquarters Governor's Island, New York. The Department of the Lakes, headquarters Chicago. The Department of the Gulf, headquarters Atlanta, etc. In this state of the case, General Otis re-embraced his early pet delusion, if it was a delusion, which charity and the probability suggest it should be called, about the insurrection having gone to pieces, and decided to come home. Possibly, also, he was homesick. General Otis was a very positive character, a strong man, but even strong men get homesick after long exile. When you hear the call of the homeland after long residence east of Suez, you must answer the call. Duty no forbidding, General Otis had stood by his in-laws and the administration with unswerving devotion for 20 months, and was entitled to come back home and tell the public all about the fighting in the Philippines, and how entirely over it was, and how wholly right and wrong the theory was in. His theory, that the visible opposition to our rule and the seeming desire to be free and independent did not represent the wishes of the Filipino people at all, but only the sinister ambitions of a few unscrupulous Tagalog leaders. Accordingly, on May 5, 1900, he was relieved at his own request by the Congress of the United States. He was succeeded in command by a very different type of man, Major General Arthur MacArthur, upon whom now devolved the problem of holding down the situation and of actually getting it stably well in hand by June 30, 1901, the day of the declaration of the term of enlistment of the 25 volunteer regiments organized under the Act of March 2, 1899. Chapter XIII. MacArthur in the War. Damn the Filipino, hallmarked Katia Ladrone. 296. Again, the story flag, civilizing native flag, and return us to our own beloved home. Army Song of the Philippines under MacArthur, 297. Someone has said, let me write the songs of a people and I care, not who makes them last. Give me the anthem songs of the world, and I will say write the history of that war that he who runs may read, and, reading, know the truth. The volunteers of 1899 had, most of them, been in the Spanish War of 98. That struggle had been so, read that, to borrow a phrase of the principal beneficiary of it, Colonel Roosevelt, there had not been war enough to go round. The Philippine insurrection had already broken out on the Spanish War. Volunteers returned from Cuba in the first half of 1899. Few of them knew exactly where the Philippines were on the map. They simply knew that we had bought the islands, that disturbances of public order were in progress there, and that the government desired to suppress them. The president had called for volunteers. That was enough. When they reached the islands, instead of finding a lot of outlaws, brigands, etc., stiffness, ill-conditioned outfitter, horse thieves and cane-field burning patriots, we volunteers of 98 had to. Thrown out of the eastern end of Cuba under General Woodena, winter 1898-9, they found Manila, on their arrival, practically almost a besieged city. They knew that the erroneous impression they had brought with them was the result of misrepresentation. Who was responsible for that misrepresentation they did not attempt to analyze. They simply set to work with American energy to put down the insurrection. Nobody questioned the unanimity of the opposition. There, it was, a fact, denied at home, but a fact, in the course of the fight, against the organized insurgent army. They lost a great many of their comrades, and in that way the unanimity of the resistance was quite forcibly impressed upon them by kindred psychologic processes equally free from mystery. Their determination to overcome the resistance early became very set, a state of mind which boded no good to the Filipinos. The army song given at the beginning of chapters I and II, in which General Otis is made to sing, after the fashion of some of the characters in Pinafore, that pensive query to himself, am I the boss, or am I a tool? The first stanza of which closes, now I'd like to know who's the boss of the show, is it me or Emilio Aguinaldo? Was a point of departure in the matter of information, which served to acquaint them with all that had gone before. They resented the loss of prestige to American arms and desired to restore that prestige. While engaged in so doing, they became aware, during the presidential year 1900, that the campaign of that year in the United States was based largely upon the pretense that the majority of the Filipinos welcomed our rule. Naturally, their experience led them to a very general and very cordial detestation of this pretense. For one thing, it was an unfair belittling of the actual military service. They were rendering people evil on whether they are evil. They trace its devious windings to its source or sources, or to enemies, all its causes, or certainly all its possible effects, or not. The real one-sided falsehood, not of point and discipline as it became later, consisted in the impression caused to be produced at home, in order to get votes, that the great body of the Filipinos people were not only in sympathy with their country's struggle for freedom, and would be really glad tamely to accept the Indian domination so benevolently offered by a superior people, but were being coerced into fighting through intimidation by a few selfish fools acting for their own selfish ends, while those fighting generals in the field, General MacArthur, for instance, whose interview with a newspaperman just after the fall of Malolos, in March 1899, subsequently verified by and before the Senate Committee of 1902, had already been noticed. At first believed that it was only a faction that we had to contend with, they soon discovered that the whole people were loyal to Aguinaldo and the cause he represented. But while the point as to how we know The resistance was remained a disputed matter for some little time among those about people who did not have to go to the races. The most curious fact of that whole historic situation, to my mind, is the absolute identity of the disputed suggestion with that which had previously been used in like cases of people struggling to be free, and the contemporaneous absence of any notation of a coincidence by any conspicuous spectator of the drama, to say nothing of a smaller fry who bore the brunt of the war or any portion of it. Those men of 99 in the journalists in 1900, Baconey, Canadian, but actually, of the original work of protest, after the manner of the British as sung by Kipling, but under the hypocritical pretense that they were doing missionary work to improve the Filipinos. They did not know whether the Filipinos could or could not run a decent government if permitted. It was too early to form any judgment, and even then there was no unanimous feeling that they could not. Brigadier General Charles King, the famous novelist, who was in the fighting out there during the first half of 1899, was quoted in the Catholic Citizen of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in June 1899, as having said in an interview given at Milwaukee, "There is no reason in the world why the people should not have the self-government which they so passionately desire, so far as their ability to carry it on goes." The real reason why the war was being waged was stated with the honesty which heated public discussion always brings forth, by Hun Charles Denby, a member of the Sherman Commission of 1899, in an article which appeared in the Forum for February 1899, entitled, "Why the Treaty Should Be Ratified," 298. The cold, hard, practical question alone remains: will the possession of the islands benefit us as a nation? If it will not, set them free tomorrow. But in the same magazine, the Forum, for June 1900, in other words, to the very same audience, in an article whose title is a protest, "Do we owe the Filipinos independence?" we find this same distinguished diplomat sagaciously deferring to that not inconsiderable element of the American public which is opposed to wars for conquest, with a rank hypocrisy which must ever characterize a republic warring for gain against the ideals that made it great. Thus, a little time ought to be conceded to the administration to ascertain what the wish of the people, meaning the people of the Philippine Islands, really is. 299. Adding some of the stale but ever welcome salve originally invented by General Otis for use by M.R. McKinley on the public conscience of America about the war having been fomented by professional politicians and not having the moral support of the whole people, a majority of the Filipinos are friendly to us, he says, even as early as January 4, 1900. In the New York Independent, we find M.R. Denby abandoning all his previous honesty of 1899 about the cold, hard, practical question, and rubbing his hands with invisible soap to the tune of the following: hypocrisy. Let us find out how many of the people want independence, and how many are willing to remain loyal to our government. It is believed a large majority, etc. 300. The same article even assumed an air of injured innocence and urged that as soon as the insurgent army laid down its arms, 301, the intentions of our government will be made known by Congress. That was just 13 years ago, and the intentions of our government have never yet been made known by Congress, despite the fact that the omission has all these years been like a buzzing insect, lighting intermittently on the sores of race prejudice and political difference in the Philippines, to say nothing of the circumstance that such omission leaves everybody guessing, including ourselves. The omission has been due to the fact that both the McKinley administration, which committed the original blunder of taking the islands, and the succeeding administrations which have been the legatees of that blunder, have always needed in their Philippine business the support, both of those whose votes are caught by the Denby honesty of 1899, and those whose votes are caught by the Denby hypocrisy of 1900. War is a great silencer of hypocrisy. In the presence of real sorrow and genuine anger, it slings away and is seen no more until more piping times. The lists of casualties had been duly bulletined to the United States from time to time between February 1899 and June 1900, so that by the date last named it had become good politics to throw off the mask. Hence, at the Republican National Convention held In Philadelphia, June 19 to 21, 1900, we find that astute past master of the science of government by parties, Senator Lodge, boldly throwing off the mask thus: "We make no hypocritical pretense of being interested in the Philippines solely on account of others. We believe in trade expansion." Now the words of a United States Senator are much listened to by an army in the field. When a war breaks out, it is usually the senator who gets you commissioned for you originally and has you promoted and made captain, colonel, or general, as the case may be, to do anything to deserve it, or you can apply to a commission if you do anything to deserve it, or sees that something couldn't be done if you die in an especially decent way. An army in the field thinks a United States senator is about one of the biggest institutions going, which, seriously, is not far from the truth. With all due respect to the blaze pessimists of the press gallery, consider then how wholly uninspiring, as a sentiment to die by and kill by, the above senatorial utterance was to the men in the field in the Philippines, who did not even then believe the islands would pay. The cold, hard, practical fact was, if the senator was to be believed, that we were fighting for what is generically called Wall Street. That it was primarily a Wall Street war, an expedition fitted out to kill enough Filipinos to make the survivors good future customers, ultimate consumers, and only incidentally a war to make people follow your way of being happy and live of their own. Yet we have most of us, but shortly previously to that, gone trooping headlong to Cuba, in the wake of the most inspiring single personality of this age, Senate Lodge's friend, Colonel Roosevelt. Some of our American thoraxes inflated with sentiments thus nobly expressed by the same distinguished senator in his speech on the resolution which declared war against Spain. "We are there," meaning in the then Cuban situation, Senator Lodge had said in the Senate, in the matchless outburst of eloquence which he set the keynote to the war with Spain. "We are there because we represent the spirit of liberty and the new time. We have grasped no man's territory. We have taken no man's property. We have invaded no man's rights. We do not ask their lands." 302. What difference, however, did it make to men under military orders, and that far away from home, where American public opinion could not, and never can affect any given situation in time to help it, whether they were serving God or the devil? Everything just gave up the primal fighting instinct, so the slaughter proceeded very nearly, at a ratio of about 16 to 1, and many a Filipino died with the word independence on his lips. 303. While many an obscure American life went out, fighting under the Denby Lodge dollar-marked flag of pseudo trade expansion, can you imagine a more thankless job? Do you wonder at the song that heads the chapter? Still, war's war, one sword in it. All through 1900, the volunteers of 1899 kept on, cheerfully doing their country's work, not in the least tempered by whys or wherefores. So far as the quality of their work went, they knew that the Filipinos were not even, and they were not perfectly clear that they themselves were doing the Lord's work, unless putting the fear of God into the heart of the insurrecto. One of their campaign expressions was the Lord's work. However, if any of them gave any special thought to the ethics of the situation, this did not lead to effective efficiency in action, but the determination just to put the Filipino into submission when the brief organized resistance of the insurgent armies in the field, February to November 1899, underwent its transition to the far more formidable guerrilla tactics. They realized that they were up against a long and tedious task, in which would be no special glamour, as there had been in Cuba, because the war was not much more popular at home than it was with them. The rank net hypocrisy of the whole situation, as they viewed it, is expressed in the song which heads this chapter. It is an answer to the taff nonsense of 1900 about the people long for peace, and are willing to accept government under United States. 304. That is why the Carabao Society do not sing it to Mr. Taft when he attends their annual banquet, notwithstanding that it is the star song of their repertoire. 305. This statement of Judge Taft's, as well as other like statements of his which followed it during the presidential campaign of 1900, would have been perfectly harmless. In home politics, It was made in the same spirit of optimism in which a Taft man will tell you today that people are willing to see the Taft administration endorsed. But at that time in the Philippines, there was no possible way to prove or disprove the statement to the satisfaction of anybody at home, or elsewhere, for that matter, and, under the circumstances, it was at once a libel on Filipino patriotism, and an ungracious belittling of the work of the American Army. It was a libel on Filipino patriotism because it denied the loyal, even if ill-advised, unanimity of the Filipino people in their struggle for independence, and was a statement made recklessly, without knowledge, innate of a presidential candidate in the United States, that it was highly inaccurate was well known to some 70,000 American soldiers then, in the field, who were daily getting insurrectly pumped into them, and also well known to their gallant commander, General MacArthur, who told Judge Taft just that thing, that it was an ungracious belittling of the work of the Army is certainly always enough, and it was so considered by the Army and its commanding general aforesaid, who practically told Judge Taft just that thing, but M.R. Root, then Secretary of War, was as much interested in M.R. McKinley's re-election as Judge Taft was, so he spread the Taft cablegrams, broadcast throughout the United States during the presidential campaign, and pigeonholed the MacArthur messages and reports on the situation in the dusty and innocuous secretaries of the War Department archives. 4 years later at the Republican National Convention of 1904, M.R. Root told the naked truth, thus: when the last National Convention met, over 70,000 soldiers from more than 500 stations held a still vigorous enemy in check. 306. The foregoing is all a record made and unalterable. It is a fair sample of the initial stages of one more of the experiment in colonization by a republic which are scattered through history and teach but one lesson. All the gentlemen concerned were personally men of high type, but look at the net result of their work. The impression it produced in the United States at a tremendously critical period in the country's history, when the men at the helm of state were bending every energy to railroad the republic into a career of overseas conquest, and using the army for that purpose, can be called by a short and ugly word. The splendor of M.R. Root's intellect is positively alluring, but he is a dangerous man to Republican institutions. M.R. Taft's part in that conspiracy for the suppression of the facts of the Philippine situation in 1900 was really due to kindliness of heart, regret at the war, and earnest hope that it would soon end. M.R. Denby's part was that of the out-and-out imperialist who has frank doubts in his own mind as to whether it is axiomatic, after all, that the form of government bequeathed us by our fathers is the best form of government yet devised. But the conspiracy was really a sin against the progress of the world, because it deceived the American people as to the genuineness and unanimity of the desire of the Filipino people to imitate the example set by us in 1776, which has since served as a beacon light of hope to so many people in so many lands in their several struggles to be free. By the spring of 1900, when General MacArthur relieved General Otis, the volunteers of 1899 had gotten thoroughly warmed up to the work of the showing the Filipinos who was in fact the boss of the show, and by June 1900, when Judge Taft arrived, they had gotten still warmer. 307. And in General Otis's successor they had a commander who understood his men thoroughly and was determined to carry out honestly, with firmness, and without hurry, as his predecessor had done, the role of political henchman, the purpose for which the army he commanded had been sent to the islands to accomplish. In this state of the case, the Taft Commission came out. This would seem rather an odd point at which to terminate a chapter on MacArthur and the war, seeing that General MacArthur continued to command the American forces in the Philippines and to direct their strenuous field operations until July 1901, more than a year later, when he was relieved by General Chaffee, on whom thereafter devolved the subsequent conduct of the war. But we must follow the inexorable thread of chronological order, and so yield the center of the stage from June 1900 on to M.R. Taft, else the resultant confusion of ideas about the American occupation of the Philippines might remain as great as that which this narrative is an attempt in some degree to correct. all through the official correspondence of 1899 and 1900 between the Adjutant General of the Army, General Corbin, and General Otis at Manila. One sees M.R. McKinley's sensitiveness to public opinion, in view of the impatience of the people. You will do thus himself, is a typical sample of this feature of that correspondence. 308. Troubled, possibly, with misgivings, as to whether, after all, in view of the vigorous and undeniably obstinate struggle for independence, the Filipinos were putting up, it would not have been wiser to have done with them as we had done in the case of Cuba, and troubled, beyond the peradventure of a doubt, about the effect of the possible Philippine situation on the fortunes of his party and himself in the approaching campaign for the presidency. M.R. McKinley sent M.R. Taft out in the spring preceding the election of 1900 to help General MacArthur win the war. We must now, therefore, turn our attention to M.R. Taft, not forgetting General MacArthur in so doing. Chapter XIV. The Taft Commission. The papers it and some, but you bet the Army knows. Kipling, Ballad of the Boer War. The essentials of the situation which confronted the Taft Commission on its arrival in the islands in June 1900, and the mental attitude in which they approached that situation, may now be briefly summarized, with entire confidence that such summary will commend itself as fairly accurate to the impartial judgment both of the historian of the future, and of any candid contemporary mind. It is not necessary to vex the dull ear of a mighty people much engrossed with their own affairs, by repetition of any further details concerning the original de facto alliance between Admiral Dewey and Aguinaldo. Suffice it to remind the people whose saving grace is a love of fair play, that, after the Battle of Manila Bay, when Admiral Dewey brought Aguinaldo down from Hong Kong to Cavite, both the Admiral and his Filipino allies were keenly cognizant of the national purpose set forth in the declaration of war against Spain, and that the Filipinos could not have been expected to make any substantial distinction between the casual remarks of a victorious admiral on the quarterdeck of his flagship in May, remarks concurrent and consistent with actual treatment of the Filipinos as allies, and the imperious commands of the general ashore in December thereafter, acting under specific orders pursuant to the Treaty of Paris. The one great fact of the situation, as huge as high Olympus, they did grasp this, that both were representatives of America on the ground at the time of their respective utterances, and that one in December, in effect repudiated without a word of explanation what the other had done from May to August. They taught us to take the city of Manila in August, and, to use the current phrase of the passing hour, coined in this period of awakening of the national conscience to a proper attitude for double dealing in general, they felt that they had been given the double cross. In other words, they believed that the American government had been guilty of a duplicity rankly Machiavellian, and that was the cause of the war. We have seen in the chapters on the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation and the Iloilo fiasco that, in the Philippines at any rate, no matter how mellifluously pacific it may have sounded at home, no matter how soothing to the troubled doubts of the national conscience, the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation of December 21, 1898, was recognized both by the 8th Army Corps and by Aguinaldo's people as a call to arms, a signal to the former to get ready for the work of civilizing with the crack, a signal to the latter to gird up their loins for the fight to the death for government of their people, by their people, for their people. And that the yearning benevolence of said proclamation was calculated strikingly to remind the Filipinos of Spain's previous traditional yearnings for the welfare of Cuba, indignantly cut short by us, yearnings to spare the great island from the danger of premature independence 309, which that decadent monarchy could not even help repeating in this one song wherein she sued to President McKinley for peace. We did not realize the absoluteness of the analogy then. It is all clear enough now. We can now understand how in Y.M.R. McKinley's program of annexation and benevolent assimilation of 1898-9 blindly earnest it was his belief that it would make the Filipino people at once cheerfully forego the legitimate aspirations to which we ourselves had originally given a momentum so generous that nothing but bullets could then possibly have stopped it, was in fact received by them in a manner compared with which Canada's response in 1911 to Speaker Champ Clark's equally benevolent suggestion of United States willingness to report the assimilation and ultimate annexation was one great sisterly sob of sheer joys at the finding of a long lost brother. From the arrival of the American troops on June 30, 1898, until the entrance of February 4, 1899, there had been two armies, camped not far from each other, one born of the idea of independence, and bent upon it, the other at first groping in the dark without instructions, and finally instructed to deny independence. There was never any faltering or evasion on the part of Aguinaldo and his people. They knew what they wanted and said so on all occasions, at all times and in all places. They made it clear, by proclamation, by letter, by conversation, and otherwise, that independence was the one thing to which, whether they were fit for it or not, they had pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. We have seen how easily the war itself could have been averted by the Bacon Resolution of January 1899, or some similar resolution frankly declaring the purpose of our government. How here was Senator Bacon, at this end of the line, pleading with his colleagues to be frank, and to make a declaration in keeping with the high purpose for which we had gone to war with Spain, instead of holding on to the Philippines on the idea that they might prove a second Klondike, while justifying such retention by arbitrarily assuming, without any knowledge whatever on the subject, that the Filipinos were incapable of self-government. How, there, at the other end of the line, at Manila, Aguinaldo's commissioners, familiar with our Constitution and the history and traditions of our government, were making, substantially, though in more diplomatic language, precisely the same plea, and imploring General Otis's commissioners to give them some assurance which would quiet the apprehensions of their people, and calm the fear that the original assurance, "We are going to lick the Spaniards and set you free," was now about to be ignored because the islands might be profitable to the United States. We have seen the war itself, as far as it had progressed by June 1900, one of the bitterest wars in history, punctuated by frequent barbarities avenged in kind, and how, if the Taft Commission had not come out with McKinley spectacles on, they would have seen the picture of a bleeding, prostrate, and deeply hostile people, still bent on fighting to the last ditch, not only animated by a feeling against annexation by us similar to that the Canadians would have today if we should also try the benevolent assimilation game on them, first with proclamations breathing benevolence and then with cannon belching grape shot, but further animated by the instinctive, as well as inherited knowledge common to all colored peoples, whether red, yellow, brown, or black, that wheresoever white men and colored live in the same country together, there the white man will rule. Understand, this was before Judge Taft had had a chance to assure them, with the kindly Taft smile and the hearty Taft handshake, that their benevolent new masters were going to reverse the verdict of the ages and treat them with a paternal love free from race prejudice. If Judge Taft could only have arrived in January 1899 and told them that the Bacon Resolution really represented the spirit of the attitude of the American people toward them, then the finally commanding bearing of M.R. Taft, and another genuine effect, his desire to see peace on earth and people toward men, might even have prevented the war. But this is merely what might have been. What actually was, when he did arrive, in June 1900, was that the milk of human kindness had long since been spilled, and his task was to gather it up and put it back in the pail, when I, a Southern man who have taken part in the only two wars this nation has had in my lifetime, reflect that in this year of grace, 1912, M.R. Underwood, otherwise matchless availability as a candidate of his party for President, questioned on the idea that it might be a tactical blunder because of the late war, which broke out before either M.R. Underwood or myself were born. I cannot share share the Taft optimism as to the rapidity with which the scars of the late war in the Philippines will heal, and as to the affectionate gratitude for the United States with which the McKinley-Taft program of benevolent assimilation will presently be regarded by the people of the Philippine Islands. We have seen Peter Elbit's the Sherman Commission of 1899, sent out that spring, in deference to American public opinion, with definite instructions to try and patch up a peace, by talking to the leading spirits of a world independence, now in full swing, about the desirability of benevolent leading strings, the meaning. The Sherman Commission had come, says M.R. McKinley, in his annual message to Congress of December 5, 1899, 310, with the hope of cooperating with Admiral Dewey and General Otis in establishing peace and order. They came. They saw. They went, recognizing the futility of the errand on which they had been sent, and now came the Taft Commission a year later, on precisely the same errand, after the Filipinos had sunk all their original petty differences and jealousies in a very reasonable instinctive common fear of economic exploitation, and a very unreasonable but, to them, very real common fear of race domination, amounting to terror, and been welded into absolute oneness, if there were somewhat lacking before, in the fierce crucible of 16 months of bloody fighting against a foreign foe for the independence of their common country. President McKinley's message to Congress of December 1899 is full of the old insufferable drivel, so grossly, though unwittingly, ungenerous to our army then in the field in the Philippines, about the triviality of the resistance we were up against. The message in one place blandly speaks of the peaceable and loyal majority who ask nothing better than to accept our authority, in another of the sinister ambitions of a few selfish Filipinos. Thus was outlined, in the message announcing the purpose to send out the Taft Commission, the view that no real, fundamental resistance existed in the islands, basing contemplated action on this sort of stuff. The presidential message outlines the presidential purpose as follows, this in December 1899, mind you. There is no reason why steps should not be taken from time to inaugurate governments essentially popular in their form, as fast as territory is held and controlled by our troops. Then follows the genesis of the idea which resulted in the Taft Commission. To this end I am considering the advisability of the return to the islands of the Commission, the Sherman Commission, or such of the members thereof as can be secured. In Cuba, General Wood began the work of reconstruction at Havana with a central government and the best men he could get hold of, and acted, through them, letting his plans and purposes percolate downward to the masses of the people. Not so in the Philippines. Reconstruction, there was to begin by establishing municipal governments, to be later followed by provincial governments, and finally by a central one. In other words, by placing the waters of self-government at the bottom of the social fabric among the most ignorant people, and letting them percolate up, according to some mysterious law of gravitation apparently deemed applicable to political physics. Of course, these poor people simply always took their cue from their leaders, knowing nothing themselves that could affect the success of this project except that we were their enemies and that they might get knocked in the head if they did not play the game. I have believed, says M.R. McKinley, in his message to Congress of December 1899, that Reconstruction should not begin by the establishment of one central civil government for all the islands, with its seat at Manila, but rather that the work should be commenced by building up from the bottom, whereat the young giant America bowed, in puzzled hope, and worldly wise old Europe smiled, in silent but amused contempt. If at the time he formulated this scheme for their government, M.R. McKinley had known anything about the Philippines, or the Filipinos, he would have known that what he so suavely called building from the bottom was like trying to make water run uphill, i.e., like starting out to have ideas percolate upward, so that through the masses the more intelligent people might be redeemed. The nigger in the woodpile lay in the words essentially popular in form. Of course no government by us essentially popular was possible at the time, but a government popular in form would. sound well to the American people, and if they could be kept quiet until after the presidential election of 1900, maybe the supposed misunderstanding on the part of the Filipinos of the benevolence of our intentions might be corrected by kindness. Accordingly, the following spring, contemporaneously with General Otis's final departure from Manila to the United States, in which free country he might say the war was over, as much as he pleased without being molested with round robins by Bob Collins, O.K. Davis, John McCutcheon, and the rest of those banes of his insular career, who so pestiferously insisted that the American public ought to know the facts. The Taft Commission was sent out to aid General MacArthur, as the Sherman Commission had aided General Otis. 311. It would seem fairly beyond any reasonable doubt that the official information the Taft Commission were given by President McKinley concerning the state of public order they would find in the islands on arrival was in keeping with the information solemnly imparted to Congress by him in December thereafter, which was as follows: by the spring of this year, 1900, the effective opposition of the dissatisfied titles always the same minimization of the task of the Army as a sop to the American conscience was virtually ended. Then follows a glowing picture of how the Filipinos are going to love us after we rescue them from the hated title, but with a circumspect reservation. He would be rash who, with the teachings of contemporary history, would fix a limit as to how long it will take to produce such a state of affairs, looking at that mighty panorama of events. From the dispassionate standpoint now possible, it seems to me that M.R. McKinley's whole Philippine policy of 1899 to 1900 was animated by the belief that the more the Philippine situation should resemble the really identical Cuban one in the estimation of the American people, the more likely his Philippine policy was to be repudiated. Polls in the fall of 1900. The Taft Commission left Washington for Manila in the spring of 1900. After their final conference with the president who had appointed them and was a candidate for re-election in the coming fall, as completely committed as circumstances can commit any man or set of men to the program of occupation which was to follow the subjugation of the inhabitants, and to the proposition of present incapacity for self-government, its cornerstone. To say nothing of the embarrassment felt at Washington by reason of having stumbled into a bloody war with people whom we honestly wanted to help, had never seen, and had nothing but the kindliest feelings for, while the serene and capacious intellect of William H. Taft was still pursuing the even tenor of its way in the halls of justice, as United States Circuit Judge for the 8th Circuit. The Philippine program was formulated at Washington. Judge Taft went to Manila to make the best of the situation which he had not created, to write the lines of that dear Commission It has been frequently stated and generally believed that when M.R. McKinley sent for him and proposed the Philippine mission, Judge Taft replied, substantially, M.R. President, I am not the man for the place. I don't want the Philippines, to which M.R. McKinley is supposed to have replied, you are the man for the place, Judge. I'd rather have a man out there who doesn't want them. The point of the original story meaning what M.R. McKinley said, the point of the repetition of it here lies in what M.R. Taft said, the inference therefrom being that he did not think the true interests of his country wanted them, and that had he been called into President McKinley's country he would have so promised. I'm even warned by his subsequent position with language of colonization, 300 It is utterly fatal to clear thinking on this great subject, which concerns the liberties of the people, which treat Judge Taft's reports as commissioner to major judicial decisions on the capacity of the Filipinos for self-government. When he consented to go out there, he went not to review the findings of the Paris Peace Commission, but at the urgent solicitation of an administration whose fortunes were irrevocably committed to those findings, including the express finding that they were unfit for self-government, and the implied one that we must remain to improve the condition of the inhabitants. He was thus not a judge, come out to decide on the fitness of the people for self-government, but an advocate to make the best possible case for their unfitness, and, its corollary, the necessity to remain indefinitely, just as England has remained in Egypt. The war itself convinced the whole army of the United States that Aguinaldo would have been the boss of the show, had Dewey sailed away from Manila after sinking the Spanish fleet. The war satisfied us all that Aguinaldo would have been a small edition of Porfirio Diaz, and that the Filipino Republic that might have been, would have been, very decidedly, a going concern, although Aguinaldo probably would have been able to say with a degree of accuracy, as Diaz might have said in Mexico for so many years, "The Republic, I am the Republic." The war demonstrated to the army, to a Q.E.D., that the Filipinos are capable of self-government, unless the kind which happens to suit the genius of the American people is the only kind of government on earth that is respectable, and the one panacea for all the ills of government among men without regard to their temperament or historical antecedents. The educated patriotic Filipinos can control the masses of the people in their several districts as completely as the captain ever controlled the company. 313, while the municipal officials of the McKinley-Taft Municipal Kindergarten were stumbling along with a strange Newtown government system imported from America and atoning to their benignant masters for mistakes by writing them letters about how benignant they, the teachers, were. They, the pupils, according to the contemporaneous description by the commanding general of the United States forces in the islands, were running a superbly efficient municipal system throughout the whole archipelago, simultaneously and in the same sphere as the American government, and in many instances through the same personnel. 314, in aid of the insurrection, General MacArthur humorously adds that the town officials acted openly in behalf of the Americans, and secretly in behalf of the insurgents, and, with considerable, apparent solicitude for the interest of both. In short, the war at once demonstrated their capacity for self-government and made granting it to them for the time being unthinkable, for the war was fought not on the issue of the capacity, but on the issue of the granting. The Treaty of Paris settled the capacity part. The Army, in 1898, 1899, and 1900 can hardly be said to have had any much more decided opinion on the capacity branch of the subject than Perry did about the Japanese in 1854, the Paris Peace Commission having solemnly decided the capacity part adversely to the Filipinos, and the war having followed. Thereafter M.R. Taft went out to make up the best case possible in support of the action of the Peace Commission, and X.V. Termini in support of everything made necessary by the fact of the purchase. Unless someone goes out to present to the American people the other side of the case, they will never arrive at a just verdict. Committed, a priori, to the task of squaring the McKinley administration with its courses to Cuba, the only course possible for the Taft Commission was to set up a benevolent government based upon the incompetency of the governed, which, being a standing affront to the intelligence of the people, earns their hatred, however it may grade their love, by the very bitterness of the opposition it permits, yet disregards. It binds itself ever more irrevocably to remain a benevolent engenderer of malevolence. Government and governed thus get wider apart as the years go by, and the raison d'etre of the former being the mental deficiencies of the latter, it must, in self-defense, assert those deficiencies the more offensively, the more vehemently, they are denied. What hope therefore can there be that the light that shone upon Saul on the road to Damascus will ever break upon the President? What hope that he will ever reattune his ears to the voice of the Declaration of Independence, calling down from where the signers, we hope without untoward exception, have gone, crying, "William, William, why persecutest thou me?" It is hard for thee to kick against the right of a people to pursue happiness in their own way. The difference between the President and the writer is that both went out to scoff and the latter remained much longer to pray. The Taft Commission arrived at Manila on June 3, 1900. loaded to the guards with kindly belief in the stale falsehood Warwick General Otis, ably assisted by his press censor, had been systematically soothing M.R. McKinley's and the general American conscience during the whole 20 months he had commanded the 8th Army Corps. 315, viz. That the insurrection was due solely to the sinister ambitions of a few selfish leaders, and did not represent the wishes of the whole people. It is true that the insurrection originally started under Admiral Dewey's auspices and under the initial protection of his puissant guns was headed by a group of men, most of whom, including Aguinaldo, were Tagalos, but all Filipinos look alike. The whole 7 or 8 millions of them, they differ from one another not one whit. More than one Japanese differs from another, and they all feel alike on most things. 316, because they all have the same customs, tastes, and habits of thought, said Governor Taft to the Senate Committee in 1902. While it is true that there are a number of Christian tribes, so-called, I do not know the number, possibly 8 or 10, or 12, that speak different languages, there is a homogeneity in the people in appearance, in habits, and in many avenues of thought. To begin with, they are Catholics. 317. Certainly this should forever crucify the stale slander, still, ignorantly repeated in the United States at intervals, which seeks to make the American people think the great body of the Filipino people are still in a tribal state, ethnologically. 318. A Tagalog leader is about as much a tribal leader as a Tammany brave of Irish antecedents. In fact, there is much in common between the two. Both are clannish. Both have a genius for organization that is simply superb. Both are irrepressible about home rule. Countless generations ago, the Filipinos were lifted by the Spanish priests out of the tribal state, and the educated people all speak Spanish. But the original tribal dialects, which the Spanish priests patiently mastered and finally reduced for them to written language, still survive in the several localities of their origin, so that every Filipino of a well-to-do family is brought up speaking two languages, Spanish, and the local dialect of his native place, which is the only language known to the poor natives of the same neighborhood. Surely, even the valor of ignorance can see that we are presumptuously seeking to reverse the order of God and nature in assuming that an alien race can lead a people out of the wilderness better than could a government by the leading men of their own race, to whom the less favored look with an ardent pride that would be a guarantee of loyal and inspiring cooperation. You can lead a balking horse to death, but you cannot make him wag his tail, or otherwise indicate contentment or a disposition to cordial cooperation which will make for progress. M.R. Bryan has visited the Philippines, and his evidence is simply cumulative of mine, as mine, based on 6 years acquaintance with the Filipinos, is simply cumulative of Admiral Dewey's testimony of 1898, so often cited in the report, and of the opinion of the George Curtis, a member of Congress from New Mexico who served 8 years in the Philippines, and believes they can safely be given their independence by 1921, M.R. Bryan says. So far as their own internal affairs are concerned, they do not need to be subject to any alien government. There is a wide difference, it is true, between the general intelligence of the educated Filipino and the laborer on the street and in the field, but this is not a barrier to self-government. Intelligence controls in every government, except where it is suppressed by military force. 9/10 of the Japanese have no part in the lawmaking. In Mexico, the gap between the educated classes and the peons is fully as great as, if not greater than, the gap between the extremes of Filipino society. Those who question the capacity of the Filipinos for self-government raises up persons fitted for the work that needs to be done. 319. It is because I believe that in the Philippines we are doing ourselves an injustice and keeping back the progress of the world by depreciating and stopping self-government and in the maintenance of free institutions that I have written this book. There is no more patriotic people in the world than the Filipino people. I base this opinion upon an intimate knowledge of them, and, in the light of considerable observation throughout most of Europe, and Asia from the Horn to the mouth of the Yangtze, wrote, 2. The nonsense, sometimes ignorant, sometimes vicious, wherewith we are regaled from time to time by Americans who go to Manila, smoke a cigar or two in some American club there, and then come back home and appreciate the Filipino people without at least correcting. Call Roosevelt's wholly uninformed and cruel random assertions of 1900 about the Filipinos being a jumble of savage tribes, and about Aguinaldo being the Osceola of the Filipinos, or their Sitting Bull. It is wonderfully inspiring to turn from such stale slander to M.R. Bryan's above statement of the case for our Oriental subjects, a statement framed in his own infinitely sympathetic and inimitable way, which says to me just what I had long wanted to express, but could not, so well, and in the midst of the recurring slander that the Filipino people are a heterogeneous lot, it is refreshing to find in a preface to the American Census of the Philippines of 1903, by the director thereof, a passage where, in comparing the tables of that census with those of the 12th Census of the United States, he says, those of the Philippine census are somewhat simpler, the differences being due mainly to the more homogeneous character of the population of the Philippine Islands, 320. When we consider the above in the light of the past and present operation of our own immigration laws, it is not flattering, but it may and should tend to awaken some realization of the manifold nature and blinding effects of current misapprehensions in the United States concerning the inhabitants of the Philippines. One Filipino does not differ from another any more than one American does from another American. In fact, they differ less. Considering immigration, the Filipino people are not rendered a heterogeneous lot by having 3 different languages, Ilocano, Tagalog, and Visayan, 321, which are respectively the languages spoken in the northern, the central, and the southern part of their country, any more than the people of Switzerland are rendered heterogeneous by the circumstance that, in northern Switzerland you find German spoken for the most part, while farther south you find French, and near the southernmost extremity some Italian. At this late date no credible person, acquainted with the facts will be so poor in spirit as to deny that the motives of the men who originally started the insurrection were patriotic, nor will anyone who served under General Otis's command in the Philippines deny that that eminent best soldier continued to cling to his early theory that it was a purely Tagalo insurrection, long after the deadly unanimity of the opposition had seeped, with all-pervading thoroughness, into the general mind of the Army of Occupation. The white flag or rag of truce, alias treachery, used to be hoisted to put us off our guard in pretense of welcomes were columns approaching their towns and burials. Such use of such a flag, followed by treachery, the ultimate weapon of the weak, has been in turn followed, with relentless impartiality in countless instances. By dint unreasoning of the vials of American wrath, until every Nita, Shek 322, in the Philippine Islands that remained unburned and had its lesson written in the blood of its occupants or their kin, to the tune of the Craig Jorgensen or the Gatling, yet General Otis's reports are always bland, and always convey the idea of an insurrection, exclusively Tagalog. In the summer of 1900, the newly arrived civilians, the Taft Commission, had no special interest in the soldiers who, for better, for worse, were doing their country's work, as Kipling calls his own country's countless wars against its refractory subjects in the Far East. And no especial sympathy was at work. 2 years later we find President Roosevelt, in connection with the general amnesty of July 4, 1902, congratulating his POW LDNites, as Mr. Dooley would call them, meaning General Chaffee and the 8th Army Corps, on a total of 2,000 combats, great and small up to that time, but you never find in any of Governor Taft's Philippine state papers any more affirmative recognition of continued resistance to American rule than some mild allusion to small but hard knocks being administered here and there by the Army. From the beginning, there was a systematic belittling, on the part of the Taft Commission, of the work of the Army, incidentally to belittling the reality and unanimity of the opposition which was daily calling it forth. 323. This was not vicious. It was essentially benevolent. It was part of the initial fermentation of their preconceived theory, but the trouble about their theory was that it was only a theory. It would not square with the facts. They were trying to square the subjugation of the Philippines with the freeing of Cuba. It is quite as soluble as the squaring of the circle. They hoped, with all the kindly benevolence of M.R. McKinley himself, that the opposition to our rule was not as great as some people seem to think. They had come out to the islands earnestly wishing to find conditions not as bad as they had been asserted to be, and the wish became father to the thought, and the thought soon found expression in words. Cablegrams to the United States presenting an optimistic view as to the prospects of necessity for further shedding of blood in the interest of benevolent assimilation, alias trade expansion. Some flippant person will say that is a polite way of charging insincerity. This book is not addressed to flippant persons. It is a serious attempt to deal with a problem involving the liberties of the whole people, and will be, as far as the writer can make it, straightforward, dignified, and candid. Judge Taft's fearful mistake of 1900 to 1901 in the matter of his premature planting of the civil government, a mistake because based on the idea that the great majority of the people welcomed American rule, and a fearful mistake because fraught with so much subsequent sacrifice of life due to too early withdrawal of the police protection of the army, was not the first instance in American history wherein ordinarily level-headed public man has, with egregious folly, mistaken the mood and temper of the whole people. The key to his mistake lay in the fact that, coming into a strange country in the midst of a war, he ignored the advice of the commanding general of the army of his country concerning the military situation, and took the advice of a few native Tories, or Copperheads, at least, who had never really been in sympathy with the insurrection and who, flocking about him, as soon as he arrived, told him what he so longed to be told, viz., that the war did not represent the wishes of the people but was kept up by a conspiracy of assassination of all who did not contribute to it either in service or money. He thereupon decided that the men who told him this really represented the voice of the people, and that the men in the field who had then been keeping up the struggle for independence for 16 months, in season and out of season, were simply mafia on a very large scale. Consequently, the Taft Commission had been in the islands less than 3 months when Secretary of War Root at Washington was giving the widest possible publicity to cablegrams from them, such as that dated August 21, 1900, mentioned in the preceding chapter, conveying the glad tidings that large number of people long for peace and are willing to accept government under United States 324. And by November next thereafter, the large number had grown to a great majority, and the willing to entirely willing. The November statement was, a great majority of the people long for peace and are entirely willing to accept the establishment of a government under the supremacy of the United States. 325. Yet, as we saw in the preceding chapter, the real situation in the Philippines at this very time was described 4 years later at the Republican National Convention of 1904 by M.R. Root thus. When the last National Convention met, over 70,000 American soldiers from more than 500 stations held a still vigorous enemy in check. Between the date of their arrival in the islands on June 30 and the date of this August 21st telegram, the Taft Commission did little junketing, but remained in Manila imbibing the welcome views of the Tories or Copperheads, and seeking very little information from the army. But it so happens that the Adjutant General at Manila used to keep a record of the daily engagements during that period, which record was later published in the Annual War Department Report 326, and it shows a total of about 500 killings of Filipinos between June 30 and August 21st, to say nothing of probably many times that number hit but not killed, and therefore able to get away. You could not include any Filipino in your return to their killings except that you had actually counted. It also happens that on June 4th, the day after Judge Taft's arrival, General MacArthur, in response to an order from Washington sent some time previous at the instance of Congress, that all the Filipino casualties our military records showed, up to that time, i.e. during the 16 months from the day of the outbreak, February 4th, 1899, to June 3rd, 1900, tabulated and totaled, and the total Filipino killed accordingly reported by cablegram to The War Department on June 4, 1900, was 10,780, 327. 10,016 months is 625 per month, so that by the time Judge Taft arrived, the Filipinos had been sufficiently beaten into submission to decrease the death rate due to the independence bug from something over 600 per month to about 200 per month. Judge Taft called this enthusiasm, I call it exhaustion, whereupon, exclaims a Boston anti-imperialist, why don't you issue Mr. Taft a certificate as a member of the Onanias Club at once, and be done with it? My answer is that I do not believe the Taft Commission in 1900 either knew these figures or wanted to know them. They came out preaching a gospel of hope to the exclusion of all else, a species of mental healing. They said, soothingly to Dame Filipina, be not afraid. You are well. You are well of the desire for independence she had conceived, when what that lady needed was a surgical operation indispensable for the removal of a stillborn child. The will of the American people is ascertainable and quadrennially announced through certain prescribed methods, and nearly everybody takes the result good-humoredly. God bless our country, whatever the result, but just how Mr. Taft and his colleagues could assume to speak for the great majority of the Filipino people at the tremendous juncture in their destinies now under consideration during the presidential election of 1900 does not clearly appear, except that in their first report they say, many witnesses were examined as to the form of government best adapted to these islands and satisfactory to the people. 328. A statement which obviously takes for granted the only point involved in the war, viz. Whether any kind of Indian government would be satisfactory to the people, and in their various other communications to Washington they described themselves, with no small degree of benevolent satisfaction, as enthusiastically received by natives not under arms at the moment of such reception. As a matter of fact, a carpetbag governor of Georgia might just as well have reported to Andrew Johnson an enthusiastic reception at the hands of the people, whose homes had lately been put to the torch, and their kin to the sword, while the whole fair face of nature from Atlanta to the sea lay bruised and bleeding under the iron heel of Sherman's army. Let no advocate of indefinite tutelage whet a scalping knife for me because of the use of that word carpetbag. It was as free from a will as the explosion incident to flashlight photography. We are trying to develop a picture of those times, to at least the definition of methods, typing life, or become all ultimate relations of life, meet the ultimate test of human confidence and friendship. You would make either, if you would consent to that, executor of your will, or testamentary guardian of your child. But they came out with the preconceived notion that kindness would win the people over, whereas what those people wanted was not foreign kindness that home rule, not silken political swaddling clothes, but freedom. And as the acquisition of the Philippines has placed us under the necessity of getting up a new definition of freedom, one consistent with tariff taxation without representation, through legislation by a Congress on the other side of the world, in which our new possessions have no vote. It should be added that one of the things freedom meant with us before 1898 was freedom to own the lands, territory, which largely determine the value of the cost and the purchase price of the necessities of life. Freedom to see the intelligent and educated men of your own race in charge of your common destiny. Freedom to have a flag and an emblem of your common interests. In a word, just freedom. And that was what the war was about. They wanted to be free and independent. Whether they were fit for such freedom is wholly foreign to the reality and unanimity of their desire for it. General Otis used to be very fond of taking the wind out of the sails of the commissioners and other officials before the outbreak by saying that their people had not the slightest notion of what the word independence meant. It is true that they knew nothing about it by experience, but equally true that, whatever it was, they wanted it. Of the 10,000 men we had already killed when Judge Taft arrived, there can be no question, as already heretofore suggested, that many of them may have been just as they were hurrying for independence. In other words, died with the word independence on their lips, when men have been thus fighting against overwhelming odds for some 16 months for government of their people by their people for their people, however inarticulate the emotions of the rank and file on going into battle. It is idle to claim that they do not know what they want, whether the great majority of the rank and file can read and write or not, but pursuant to the idea that kindness would cure the desire for independence, Judge Taft ignored, in the outset, all advice from the military department, because that was not the kindest person, accepting, as truly representative of the temper of the whole people, the views of a few ultra-conservatives of large means who had always been part and parcel of the Spanish administration. On the other hand, General MacArthur and the whole 8th Army Corps had seen a great insurrection drag on from month to month and from one year to another under General Otis, when short shrift would have been made of it in the outset, and far less life sacrificed, if M.R. McKinley had not needed, in aid of his Philippine policy, the support of both of those who believed it was right and of those who believed it would pay. The one central thought which had seemed to animate General Otis from the beginning, a thought which we have already traced through all its humiliating manifestations, was that he must neither do or permit anything that might hurt the administration, when the impatience of the people at home, which figures so prominently in the correspondence already cited between the Adjutant General of the Army, General Corbin, and General Otis at Manila, had begun to cast its shadows on the presidential year 1900. The mastermind of M.R. Root had interrupted the fatal Otis treatment of the insurrection, indicated by General Otis's long failure to call for volunteers, his stupid stream of situation well-intended insurrection about the collapse, telegrams, and his utterly unpardonable persistence in calling it a purely Tagalog insurrection, by sending him a competent force and a plan of campaign, and directing him to carry out the plan. General Otis did this because he was told to, and then began again to sing the same old song. MacArthur, Wheaton, Lawton, Bates, Young, Funston, and the rest of the fighting generals had submitted to all the Otis follies without a murmur, because insubordination degrades an army into rabble. But the 329 believed the army was there to put down that insurrection, not to have a symposium with its leaders on the rights of man. They had taken up the white man's burden, after the manner of Lord Kitchener and Roberts, and they had no qualms. Above all, they wanted peace, no matter how much fighting it took to get it. Mindful of the attempts of the Sherman Commission of the year before to mix peace with war, and of the immense encouragement thus given the insurgents, they had not looked forward with enthusiasm to the coming of the Taft Commission, and to the highly probable renewal of negotiations with the insurgent leaders in the field, pursuant to a presidential policy of patching up the peace at any price, suggested by the exigencies of political expediency, to give the government a semblance of having more or less of the consent of the governed. That the anticipations of the military authorities in this regard did not receive a pleasant disappointment has already been suggested by the nature of the views adopted by the Commission soon after its arrival. The military view of the situation, as it stood when Judge Taft and his colleagues arrived at Manila in June 1900, is set forth in the annual report of the commanding general, General MacArthur, rendered shortly thereafter. Rendered, not in aid of any political candidate at home, nor of a sudden, but at the usual and customary annual season for the making of such reports, and rendered by a soldier of no mean experience and ability, who was a man of great kindliness of heart as well, to the War Department of his government, to acquaint it with the facts of a military situation he had been dealing with for 2 years prior to the arrival of the Taft Commission. General MacArthur's views, as expressed in his report, must now be contrasted with the Taft view, not to show that MacArthur is a bigger man than Taft, nor for any other idle or petty purpose, but because, if, in 1900, General MacArthur was right, and Judge Taft was wrong, about the unanimity of the whole Filipino people against us, then the institution of the civil government of the Philippines on July 4, 1901, was premature. and, therefore, by reason of the withdrawal of the strong arm of the military at a critical period of public order, it was not calculated to give adequate protection to the lives and property of those who were willing to abandon the struggle for independence and submit to our rule. And if, as we shall see later, it did in fact grossly fail to afford such adequate protection for life and property, it was derelict in the most sacred duty enjoined upon it by N.R. McKinley's instructions to the Taft Commission. But first let me introduce you to General MacArthur. General MacArthur not only was a ability, but a statesman as well. Moreover, he was a thorough expansionist. He believed in keeping the Philippines permanently, just as England does her colonies, but he was perfectly honest about it. He recognized the fact that they were against our rule, but he did not attach any more weight to that circumstance than Lord Kitchener would have done. Also, he had come out of the islands with the first expedition, in 1898, had been in the field continuously for 15 months prior to assuming supreme military command, and knew the Filipinos thoroughly. As soon as he took command, on May 5, 1900, of the 70,000 troops then in the islands, he set himself with patience and firmness to the great task of ending the insurrection, which at that time promised to continue indefinitely. The far more formidable guerrilla warfare that had followed the brief period of serried resistance having now settled down to a chronic stage, aided and abetted by the whole population. I have said General MacArthur was a thoroughgoing expansionist. This needs a slight qualification. At first he appears to have had a few qualms shortly after the outbreak of the war with the Filipinos, when he took the first insurgent to in March 1999. He had said at Malolos, as we have seen, to a newspaperman who accompanied the expedition: "When I first started in against these rebels, I believed that Aguinaldo's troops represented only a faction. I did not believe that the whole population of Luzon was opposed to us. But I have been reluctantly compelled to believe that the Filipinos are loyal to Aguinaldo and the government which he represents." 330. General MacArthur's reports concerning the war in the Philippines during the period of his command are succinct and luminous. He makes it perfectly clear that the original resistance offered by the insurgent armies in the States after the arrival of the overwhelmingly ample reinforcements sent out from this country in the fall of 1899 was little more than a mere flash in the pan, compared with the well-planned scheme of resistance which followed the dispersion of those armies to the several provinces which had furnished them to the cause, and Aguinaldo's simultaneous flight into the mountains, with his government concealed about his person, as Senator Lodge exaltedly described that incident in his speech of April 1900 in defense of the administration's Philippine policy. Speaking of this period, General MacArthur says, "It has since been ascertained that the expediency of adopting guerrilla warfare from the inception of hostilities was seriously discussed by the native leaders, and advocated with much emphasis, as the system best adapted to the peculiar conditions of the struggle. It was finally determined, however, that a concentrated field army, conducting regular operations, would, in the event of success, attract the favorable attention of the world, and be accepted as a practical demonstration of capacity for organization and self-government. The disbandment of the field army, therefore, having been a subject of contemplation from the start, the actual event, in pursuance of the deliberate action of the Council of War in Bimbang about November 12, 1899, already hereinbefore noticed, was not regarded by Filipinos in the light of a calamity, but simply as a transition from one form of action to another. A change which by many was regarded as a positive advantage, and was relied upon to accomplish more effectively the end in view. The Filipino idea behind the dissolution of their field army was not a and as a consequence, misleading conclusions were reached to the effect that the insurrection itself had been destroyed, and that it only remained to sweep up the fag end of the rebel army by a system of police administration not likely to be either onerous or dangerous. 331. In his report covering the period from May 5th to October 1st, 1900, General MacArthur says of the policy of resistance above outlined, the country affords great advantages for the practical development of such a policy. The practice of discarding the uniform enables the insurgents to appear and disappear almost at their convenience. At one time they are in the ranks as soldiers, and immediately thereafter are within the American mindset, the attitude of peaceful natives, absorbed in a dense mass of sympathetic people. 332. In this same connection, the report includes a copy of the original order of the insurgent government, which was the cornerstone of the guerrilla policy, and states that systemized regulations for its effective execution. A bill has been compiled and published by the Filipino Junta, or Revolutionary Committee at Madrid, and distributed among the insurgent forces. The report also appends a copy of the army regulations under which the insurgent forces were to conduct the guerrilla warfare. It also describes in detail the system of warfare prescribed under these regulations, and states that as a result of the measures which General MacArthur took to combat warfare, the 53 stations of American troops occupied in the archipelago on November 1, 1899, had on September 1, 1900, expanded to 413, and that during this period, the casualties to our troops were 268 killed, 750 wounded, 55 captured, and to the insurgents, so far as our records show, 3227 killed, 694 wounded, and 2864 captured, says he. The extensive distribution of troops has strained the soldiers of the army to the full limit of endurance. Each little command has had to provide its own service of security and information by never ceasing patrols, explorations, escorts, outposts, and regular guards. An idea seems to have been established in the public mind. He meant the public mind at home, of course, that the field work of the army is in the nature of police, in regulating a few bands of guerrillas, and involving none of the vicissitudes of war. Previous meaning the Otis theory, then being industriously circulated in the United States, such a narrow statement of the case is unfair to the service. In all things requiring endurance, fortitude, and patient diligence, the guerrilla period has been preeminent. It is difficult for the non-professional observer, he means Judge Tapp, to understand that apparently desultory work, such as has prevailed in the Philippines during the past 10 months. 333 has demanded more of discipline and as much of valor as was required during the period of regular operations against the concentrated field forces of the insurrection. It is, therefore, a great privilege to speak warmly in respect to the importance of the service rendered day by day, with unremitting vigilance, by the splendid men who, etc. 334. It was not until July 4, 1902, that President Roosevelt officially declared, by his amnesty proclamation of that date, that the insurrection in the Philippines was at last ended. It was by no means beaten to a frazzle, as we shall later see, but of course, knowing the impatience of a large portion of the American people with a situation about which there was a widespread notion that much remained undisclosed, Mr. Roosevelt would have issued such a proclamation earlier, had the facts seemed to him to so authorize. General MacArthur's relentless never-ceasing patrol, explorations, etc., continued straight on through the presidential campaign of 1900, side by side in point of time with the Rosie Taft cablegrams of the same period, and long thereafter. How long will be later indicated, says General MacArthur, in his report for 1901. It had been suggested that some of the Filipino leaders were willing to submit the issue to the judgment of the American people, which was soon to be expressed at the polls, and to abide by the result of the presidential election of November 1900. 335. But subsequent events demonstrated that the hope of ending the war without further infusion of blood was not well founded, and that as a matter of fact the Filipinos were organizing for several desperate resistance by means of the general banning of the people in support of the guerrillas in the field. 336. General MacArthur then goes on to tell how, as part of this program, the insurgent authorities announced a final and inflexible principle, to the effect that every native, without any exception, residing within the limits of the archipelago, owed active allegiance to the insurgent cause. This jurisdiction was enjoined under severe penalties, which were systematically enforced. This is what Judge Taft afterwards described as a conspiracy of murder, a mafia on a very large scale. 337. The characterization being made in support of this theory that the great majority of the people with whom we were then at war would welcome our rule if allowed to follow the will of the and that they were being coerced to fight for the independence of their country. General MacArthur's view, however, did not support this theory. His report deals with the stance of the subject thus. The cohesion of Filipino society in behalf of insurgent interests is most emphatically illustrated by the fact that assassination, which was extensively employed, was generally accepted as a legitimate expression of insurgent governmental authority. The individual did not appeal to American protection, although condemned exclusively on account of supposed pro-Americanism. Later on, when we came to understand the Filipinos better, this summary method of dealing with the faint-hearted lost much of its initial horrifying force, and the failure of such to appeal to us for protection lost much of its strangeness. In the first place, no doubt, let's observe it, even those with whom he claims to have betrayed his countrymen do not trust him implicitly. Again, Latin countries never assume that before a man is punished for alleged crime he has been confronted with the witnesses against him. Such testimony is, under their jurisprudence, frequently received in his absence. The legal department of General MacArthur's office once got hold of a captured insurgent paper subscribed with the autograph of Juan Cales, one of their best generals. It directed that a named Filipino residing in a certain town garrisoned by American troops be executed. We, of course, would call it assassinated at a certain hour on a certain day in a public street of the town, and that the soldier or soldiers performing the execution should declare to the bystanders, if any, in so doing, that it was done because the man was a traitor. A friend of the Americans, we kept this paper, intending to hang Juan whenever he should be captured. He held out a long time, and finally surrendered unconditionally, but he proved such an elegant fellow, game as a pebble, courteous as Chesterfield, and immensely popular with his people, that it was decided he could be of more service as a live governor of a province than he could as a dead general. 338. So he was appointed a provincial governor by Governor Taft, and made a splendid official. Another reason why Filipinos suspected, during the insurrection, by the more obstinate and stout-hearted of the compatriots who held out longer in its struggle for independence, of weakening toward the cause of their country, in other words, suspected of what might be called copperhead or Tory tendencies, would not appeal to us for protection, is strikingly presented in General MacArthur's report for 1901. He says they naturally had grave doubt as to the wisdom of siding with us, as the United States had made no formal announcement of an inflexible purpose to hold the archipelago and afford protection to pro-Americans. 339. The one great thing that has crippled progress in the Philippines from the beginning of the American occupation down to date is an uncertainty as to what our policy for the future is to be, the lack of some formal announcement of an inflexible purpose. And of course, I mean, as General MacArthur meant by formal announcement, an authoritative declaration by the lawmaking power of the government. If Congress should formally declare that it is the purpose of this government to hold the Philippines permanently, American and other capital would at once go there in abundance, and the place would blossom like a rose. If, on the other hand, Congress should formally declare that it is the purpose of this government to give the Filipinos their independence as soon as a stable native government can be set up, thus holding out to the present generation the prospect of living to see the independence of their country, the place would also quickly blossom as aforesaid through the generous ardor of native love of country. In either event, everybody out there would know where he is at present. All is uncertainty, both with the resident members of the dominant alien race and with those over whom we are ruling. It took over 120,000 American troops, first and last, to put down the struggle of the Filipinos for independence. 340. The war began February 4, 1899, and the last public official announcement that it was ended was on July 4, 1902. 341. Of course, this does not imply that every province was at all times during that period a theater of actual war. Putting down the insurrection was something like putting out a fire in a field of dry grass. At first the trouble was general. Gradually it diminished toward the end, but for a while, no sooner was it quenched in one province than it would break out in another. How the Filipinos were able to prolong the struggle as long as they did against such apparently overwhelming odds is most interestingly explained by General MacArthur in his report for 1900, after describing the method he followed of establishing native the institution of municipal government under American auspices, of course, carried the idea of exclusive fidelity to the sovereign power of the United States. All the necessary moral obligations to that end were readily assumed by municipal bodies, and all outward forms of loyalty and decorum carefully preserved. But precisely at this point the psychological conditions referred to about meaning the unity against us 342 began to work with great energy in assistance of insurgent field operations. For this purpose most of the towns secretly organized complete insurgent municipal governments to proceed simultaneously and in the same sphere as the American government and in many instances through the same personnel, that is to say, the presidentess and town officials acted openly in behalf of the Americans and secretly in behalf of the insurgents, and, paradoxical as it may seem, with considerable apparent solicitude for the interests of both, in all matters touching the peace of the town, the regulation of markets, the primitive work possible on roads, streets, and bridges, and the institution of schools. Their open activity was commendable. At the same time they were expecting and collecting contributions and supplies and recruiting men for the Filipino forces, and sending all obtainable military information to the Filipino leaders, wherever, throughout the archipelago, there is a group of the insurging army. It is a fact beyond dispute that all contiguous towns contribute to the maintenance thereof. In other words, the towns, regardless of the fact of American occupation and town organization, are the actual bases for all insurgent military activities. And not only so in the sense of furnishing supplies for the so-called flying columns of guerrillas, but of supplying the pure forces of resistance. And this is now the most important factor of Filipino tactics to disband when closely pressed in successfully in the U.S. area. A maneuver quickly accomplished by reason of the assistance of the people and the ease with which the Filipino soldier is transformed into the appearance of a peaceful native. 343. To contrast a cold, hard military fact involving the lives of American soldiers with a lot of political nonsense intended for consumption, the United States during a presidential election. The next paragraph is particularly interesting in the light of the contemporaneous Taft view. 344. The success of this unique system of war depends upon first, complete unity of action of the entire native population. That such unity is a fact is too obvious to admit of discussion. Intimidation has undoubtedly accomplished much to this end, but fear as the only motive is hardly sufficient to account for the united and apparently spontaneous action of several millions of people. 345. One traitor in each town would effectually destroy such a complex organization. Then follows this bit of grim humor. It is more probable that the adhesive principle comes from ethnological homogeneity, which induces men to respond for a time to the appeals of consanguineous leadership. In other words, to stick to their own kith and kin. He had in a previous paragraph used that very expression. Thus, the people seem to be actuated by the idea that in fact, the war men are never near, right then when going with their own kith and kin. In all the foregoing, General MacArthur was not simply trying to score a point against Judge Taft, though his resentment of the effort of the Taft Commission of 1900 to mix politics with war in the presidential year was quite as decided and quite as well known in the islands at the time, as was General Otis's similar attitude toward the Sherman Commission of the previous year. 346. He is simply laying before the War Department, as a soldier, the familiar facts of a situation which he had been dealing with for 2 years past, as well known to the 70,000 officers and men under his command as to himself, and S. The details into which he goes are simply prefatory to an account of the remedy he applied to the situation. That remedy must now claim our attention. The remedy General MacArthur finally applied was a proclamation signed for the Filipino people of all classes throughout the archipelago. It read, and especially to the leaders in the field, many of whose captured comrades in arms who lived now bearing the frontier, the severities sanctioned by the laws of civilized nations under such circumstances, and the reasons therefore. And, further, serving them with notice that thenceforward he proposed to enforce those laws with full rigor. 347. The eminent lawyers of the Taft Commission were too busy about that time acquainting themselves with the situation through natives not in arms to attach much importance to General MacArthur's proclamation, but the 8th Army Corps always believed that that proclamation, and the Army's work under it, was the main factor in making the civil government at all possible. July 4, 1901, the issuance of this document was not only a wise military move, but a subtle stroke of statesmanship as well. It assumed that the Filipino people were a civilized people, an assumption never indulged by Spain during the whole of her rule, but always freely admitted by General MacArthur in all his dealings with their leading men to be a fact. It therefore appealed to your more proper, and to the noblesse oblige of many of the most obstinate and trusted fighting leaders. The writer was, at the date of the proclamation under consideration, on duty at General MacArthur's headquarters, as assistant to Colonel Crowder, his Judge Advocate, now Judge Advocate General of the United States Army, and prepared the first rough, tentative suggestions for the final draft of it, accompanying such suggestions with a memorandum showing the course taken by Wellington in France in 1815, and by Bismarck's generals at the close of the Franco-Prussian War, as well as that followed under General Order No. 100, 1863, for the government of the armies of the United States in the field, having then entertained the opinion that that proclamation, though drastic